When a society has no color differentiation of pens, then there is no goal. Kintzadza. Lord Baal, the terminal at the entrance signaled, and Dr. Franklin's voice came from the speaker. "Welcome, Doctor." The door opened, letting the medic in. "I trust you brought what you promised?" "Yes, but Lord Baal." The doctor put the small metal case he had been holding in his hands on the floor. "I would like to ask, if possible, that you return this device to me when you finish examining it. I understand that the instructions do not provide for this in any way, but sometimes there is simply no other way out. If it were not for your help, I would have to use it to help Mr. Garibaldi." "Your motives are clear, Dr. Franklin." I thoughtfully cast a glance at the medic and his cargo. "Well, I suppose I won't pretend that I'm a more harmful creature than I actually am. I'll return this artifact to you after I've finished studying it."
If, I raise my finger, its use is needed earlier and it's absolutely necessary, I'll return it to you or resolve the issue myself. The main thing is not to abuse my good nature. Of course. Stephen nodded his head slightly twitchingly several times. "That's great," I smiled broadly, stroking my beard. "In that case, since we've finished the business part of the conversation, would you like some tea?" "No, thank you," the man shook his head, sighing heavily. "There was a massive Drazi brawl in the Zocalo an hour ago. I have work." "I understand," I nod. "In that case, have an easy shift, Dr. Franklin." "Thank you." Taking another look at the case on the floor and sighing again, Franklin gave a short, jerky bow and left the cabin. As soon as the door closed behind the medic, the replicators received the corresponding command, and a thin beam of teleportation struck from the ceiling, scanning the contents of the case, as it had previously done with the triluminary and the lens cocoon. The ambassador, by the way, successfully completed her transformation, delighting all those interested with her changed image. Even I was imbued with one thing, to understand how the studied device works in theory, and quite another to see the results of this work visually. The Minbari retained almost unchanged the general features of her appearance, such as the crest, but at the same time, many things in her had undergone changes. Thick dark hair appeared on her previously completely bald head, growing both above and below the crest, which now looked more like a kind of crown worn on the head. The auricle slightly increased in size, becoming closer to human ones and probably somewhat changing the range of frequencies available to the woman. Of course, the greatest changes were hidden deep inside. However, this was not a problem. The copy of the triluminary created by the teleporter in the laboratory was no worse than the original. Having put the case against the wall so that it wouldn't get in the way of the passage, I go to the table and just sit down in the chair when the terminal on the table suddenly gave a melodic signal of an incoming call, and at the same time the replicators built into the walls of the cabin recorded a complex encrypted broadband transmission coming from somewhere on the opposite end of the Babylon. The next moment the call itself was accepted, and the screen showed the face of a man with a bald head unfamiliar to me. Lord Baal, I presume. The man was extremely gloomy and slightly puzzled. You guessed it, I raised an eyebrow tracking the source of the signal. It appeared that my persistent and not particularly polite new acquaintance was in one of the station's cabins and was currently sitting in front of his terminal, his eyes closed and his hands on the device's body. Curious. "Do you mind if I come over to your place and we can discuss a few issues?" "To begin with, it would be polite to introduce yourself, don't you think?" "When we meet, I'll be there in half an hour." The man cut the connection, but the replicators continued to monitor the thin, encrypted but still discernible communication channel stretched between our two terminals, bypassing the standard communication lines of the station. So that's what they were like, technomages. If this was, of course, one of them. I remembered this part of the information about the world extremely fragmentarily. And in the cinematic universe, as I recall, very, very little was said about this order of sorcerers, leaving them at the mercy of various spin-offs and literary works with which I was slightly less familiar than not. However, I remembered and knew two things for sure. Technomages were rare assholes among their number, considering themselves, however, almost deservedly,
above others due to the possession of inaccessible knowledge and technological achievements, and they, yes, possessed technological knowledge and achievements inaccessible to other races. And this knowledge, if I remembered correctly, put them on a sufficient level to cause an active reaction in the Vorlons and Shadows who wanted to destroy or subjugate and set on the right path this order.
And now one of them called my terminal without asking, picked up the phone at the other end himself, and simply presented me with the fact that he would come to visit in half an hour. Well, he's a wonderful accomplice. Person, isn't he? A satisfied smile grimace floated on his face by itself. Corona, in half an hour I will have a rather unusual guest. The ship of the Technomage order is in the 5th dock, Danica immediately answered. Docking place 8B, Hatak in orbit of the planet Epsilon 3, as well as your personal ship, are ready for unforeseen developments. Both ships really moved closer to the station, however, pretending that nothing is happening. The results of passive scanning of the ship and the members of the order who arrived at the station did not reveal any known types of weapons or particularly powerful energy sources. The probability of a direct confrontation—
Don't go too far! I stopped the girl who is clearly preparing to physically destroy the guests. The probability of a direct battle with the Technomages is currently below 15%, 14.789, my attaché clarified pedantically. Exactly. Besides, according to my information, the Technomages did not want to participate in the coming crisis. At the moment, they are not enemies. Well, I can easily tolerate rudeness. In any case, countermeasures are ready. Well done. Lord Baal, Yuki joined in. Perhaps one of us should be present? As far as I know, in some cases the format of the meeting requires this. An image of readiness came through the subspace network, although I clearly saw that both girls were currently walking around the station's recreational area, thinking about which establishment to visit and whether it was worth doing.
Not yet necessary. I mentally shake my head. The guest will be much more willing to say something interesting in a private conversation than in front of witnesses. The Technomage turned out to be surprisingly punctual. The replicators, scattered around the station, detected his appearance on my level of the embassy sector, and 2 minutes later, exactly the half hour he had announced, the man stopped in front of the cabin door and touched the sensor on the door. The Technomage was dressed in a stylish black robe, most appropriate to the title of sorcerer in the understanding of representatives of humanity. Having given the command to open the door, I stand up from my chair to meet the incoming guest, studying him with interest with my own eyes. The Technomage was obviously not young. This was read in the collected and somewhat suspicious look of his brown eyes, which betrayed great life experience.
And also, it was he who was the source of the signal, the channel of which was still laid in the terminal of my cabin. It seems that the Technomage had some complex implant that allows him to operate technological devices. So, the silence and exchange of glances had already dragged on for 10 seconds, during which my guest continued to simply look without taking any action. You so persistently declared your desire for a personal meeting, but you came only to remain silent? I raise an eyebrow in slight bewilderment. My name is Elric. The Technomage finally broke the silence, looking over his shoulder at the sound of the cabin door closing. I belong to the Order of Technomages. The next moment, Elric looked straight into my eyes, and the nanites that made up my body detected the same encrypted signal that he had used to communicate with the station's terminal before. Only the flow of information was much more complex and multi-layered. The data more like a living creature trying to find something to cling to, something familiar to this spell and its creator. But there was simply nothing to cling to. Tilting my head to the side in mild curiosity, I watched as Elric first frowned in confusion, then his face showed tension and concentration. The flow of information directed towards me at that moment became several times denser and more intense. And finally the Technomage opened his eyes in shock, taking a step back towards the door. Something in his actions clearly went wrong, and my name, as you already know, I spread my hands, is Lord Baal. I belong to the Goa'uld race, and am the ambassador of the intergalactic empire of the same name, on the Babylon 5 station. But you clearly expected to hear something different, didn't you? I beg your pardon, Lord Baal. There was probably a misunderstanding. I mistook you for...
For someone else. The technomage took another step back, trying to connect with the electronic lock on the door in the same way, but nothing worked. The titanium plate didn't even budge, although the indicator on the lock showed a green signal of an open state. Anything can happen, Technomage Elric. I nod sympathetically. Nevertheless, I would be interested to hear what, or rather who exactly you expected to meet in my place. At the very least, this is required by the simplest rules of decency, inherent, I believe, even to members of your… order. Would you like a cup of tea? A narrow and concentrated pulse signal passed from the technomage somewhere beyond the cabin. It seemed he was trying to contact his colleagues, who were also present at the station, but the walls of the cabin, consisting of replicator blocks on the inside, only recorded this attempt, not allowing the signal to pass further. Well, Elric sighed heavily, rubbing his face with his palms, and when he lowered them, his expression showed some semblance of resignation to fate. I suppose my behavior does require some explanation. Thank you. Tea would be very welcome. Nodding, I slowly measure out the tea leaves, pouring them into a small ceramic teapot, and set the desired temperature on the local equivalent of a kettle for boiling water. While the water reaches the desired conditions, I just as slowly take out a tray and place 2 cups, 2 saucers, spoons, sugar and cookies on it. Everything happens in complete silence, interrupted only by the light clanging of dishes.
Watching my actions, Elric shifted from foot to foot with uncertainty for a while, but still decided to take a couple of steps forward and sit down in one of the chairs in the corner of the cabin, arranged around the coffee table, which had recently been favored by Corona and Yuki for sisterly gatherings over tea and sweets. So, I'm listening to you. I put the tray with the tea set on the table, sit down in the second chair, fill one of the cups with the aromatic drink, and, moving it closer to my guest, repeat the actions for myself, looking expectantly at my interlocutor. First of all, Elric sighed once again, accepting the cup and sniffing the steaming tea. I must once again apologize for my somewhat harsh behavior. Even after visually relaxing and agreeing to tea, the technomage remained clearly collected and focused, carefully checking the words he spoke and closely monitoring my reactions to them.
Your apologies are accepted, Technomage Elric. I nod graciously, taking a sip of tea.
Thank you. Also, I would like to explain the reason for my behavior. Our order, the order of technomages, is not very numerous.
The man also took a sip from his cup, for a second surprised to assess the quality of its contents, and then carefully placed the dish on the table.
However, even with a small number, many of my colleagues lead a rather extravagant lifestyle, sometimes falling out of the sight of others for many years.
Let me guess. I squint slightly. You thought that I could be one of those extravagant technomages.
I allowed for this possibility,
Elric nodded.
And since in my lifetime it has happened more than once that such recluses went in a dangerous direction on the path of studying our capabilities, in general, a technomage who gets carried away becomes dangerous and unpredictable.
And what is your order anyway? I raise my eyebrows with interest.
I mean, I've seen mentions of your existence on the internet, but you understand perfectly well what a dump it really is, I smile, and how difficult it is to find reliable information there if there is very little information in general.
Yes, Elric nodded.
Perhaps you are right, we do not strive for wide fame and, frankly speaking, we appear in densely populated worlds quite rarely. Well, I will allow myself a brief historical background. Yes, please. I lean back in my chair with a cup in my hands. The history of our order goes back many centuries, Elric began after a few seconds of silence, collecting his thoughts. And not all of us belong to the human race. Honestly, very little information about the first technomages has reached our time. Training manuals, techniques, recommendations from more experienced technomages for younger generations, by and large, that's all.
We know for sure that the very first technomages lived more than 1,000 years ago and belongs to an alien race called the Taratimur.
The man shrugged. Apart from the name and their language, which we learn in memory of traditions, we have no information left. But what is technomagic? In the cultures of many peoples at certain moments in the development of civilizations, there are various beliefs in mystical powers. I move my fingers in the air. In particular, for humanity, these were magic and belief in divine miracles. And what are miracles, Lord Baal? Our ancestors saw lightning striking from the sky during a thunderstorm and considered it a manifestation of the wrath of the gods. Elric shrugged. And now, some several thousand years later, we know that it is just atmospheric electricity, subject to simple and understandable laws of physics. And take a thermonuclear reactor. Could you explain to an ignorant ancestor what it is and how it works?
Wouldn't it be easier to just call it magic? So, I take another sip of tea. A simple hoax. The right set of technological achievements and the right presentation of oneself. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The technomage smoothly moved his hand, and a bright, beautiful butterfly appeared on his palm out of thin air, slightly flapping its wings. A simple illusion, a hologram, as they say now. But can you say that the divine miracles described in the sacred books of any given civilization were not actually created with the help of technology? Insanely advanced, incredibly complex and powerful, but technology. We are dreamers, Lord Baal. The man clenched his fist, causing the butterfly to disappear. But the replicators in the walls of the cabin recorded tiny scraps of signal, particles of program code flying apart and settling on surfaces. Creators, singers and creators.
We study the secrets of lasers and microcircuits, crystals and scanners. We create holographic demons and compose spells from equations and formulas. Yes, perhaps you are right, putting the cup on the table. I thoughtfully stroke my beard with my fingers. More than half of your own Earth legends, as I see, are the results of our brief visits to your planet. In some matters, your ancestors, of course, went a bit too far. Take at least that awkward story with the Egyptian pyramids. Rolling my eyes for a second, I make a hand-to-face gesture. However, I will be frank. Since our last meeting, your civilization has made a colossal step forward. My congratulations. Pyramids? A meeting? Judging by the expression on his face, Elric was clearly beginning to understand that, firstly, the conversation was clearly going somewhere wrong, and secondly, he clearly didn't understand something. I wave my hand. An excellent illustration of what self-emerging cargo cults can lead to, without constant supervision. In any case, I understand perfectly well what you were talking about. Underdeveloped native peoples are indeed more likely to accept the simplest technology as miracles or magic. Here we are, Lord Baal. Having difficulty coping with his emotions, Elric tried to get his face back, saluting me with a trembling hand with his cup, which sent another string of pieces of computer code towards the terminal on the table. We live and create precisely within the framework of this uncertainty, believing that nothing is fundamentally impossible in this world. But why did you mistake me for one of your colleagues? My mistake. The man bowed his head penitently. We have certain ways of recognizing each other, special signals, marks, if you will, and something around you seemed similar to me.
There were differences, and now, up close, the technomage looked at me with an attentive gaze. I see that these differences are much more radical than can be explained by a simple attempt at camouflage. I hope my behavior did not offend you. My guest continued to speak. His voice was demonstratively polite, showing excellent manners and upbringing. But at the same time, the replicators once again recorded the signal impulse sent by Elric somewhere beyond the cabin, and once again, they successfully did not let it through. Realizing that there was still no answer from his brothers, the man decided to go from the other side along the channel that had previously connected him and my terminal. A fairly large data flow passed, stringing on itself the code elements scattered around the cabin, after which the device's display briefly blinked several times, and a ligature of symbols and geometric figures unknown to me ran along it.
Technomage Elric. I shake my head sympathetically, put my cup on the table, addressing the man with a serious, intent look. I am, without a doubt, a very generous and friendly representative of my species, and I can fully understand and accept unfortunate misunderstandings, especially those that occur due to the incorrect interpretation of some events or phenomena. But I cannot call your current behavior anything other than rudeness. Do you realize that you are trying to hack a terminal in the cabin of an ambassador of a foreign state? sitting directly opposite this very ambassador, continuing to politely smile in his face. Elric's expression changed, and he suddenly stood up from his chair, taking a few steps back and quickly bringing his hands together in front of his chest, forming a complex, geometric figure with his fingers.
The next moment, the replicators recorded a sharp surge of energy, tied in space to the figure of the technomage, but unidentifiable in terms of its source. And a brightly shining fireball the size of a tennis ball flew in my direction from the wave of the interlocutor's hand. It flew and, without any additional effects, dissolved into the air, barely touching the external nanites of my body. "So you don't understand," Elric visibly tensed up, forming some figure with his hands again, and a thin violet beam of energy struck me in the direction of me, like two peas in a pod, similar to the shot from the Ship of Shadows, only noticeably less powerful. But the technomage didn't have time to do anything else, only blinking in shock at the sight of the completely absent result of both his attacks. The nanites formed the already tested pattern of the set Niktal, and a thin branched blue lightning struck from the fingertips of the hand directed towards the man. "Feel the force, Elric." But to his credit, unlike the previous cold guinea pigs, Elric resisted the effect of the Zetnik tail for almost twice as long. The first 0.785 seconds. Even being halfway to unconsciousness, the technomage tried to somehow resist the lightning that struck him. The replicators detected bursts of energy, completely uncharacteristic of the sources around us, but 89.657% matching the signatures of the shadow ship that fell into my hands some time ago. But even after holding out for a total of 1.4453 seconds, Elric still sank to the floor, rolling his eyes and withdrawing into himself. Curious, but time was precious. If he could somehow resist my influence, there was no guarantee that the unconsciousness would last the required time, and the second Zetnik tail discharge received immediately after the first would kill the victim. The network gave a probability of 54% that this would not have happened in Elric's case. But the figure was too low, and there was too little knowledge about the capabilities of technomages to conduct natural tests. Besides, simple methods are the most reliable methods. The teleport beam struck from the ceiling, scanning the technomage's body atom by atom and analyzing its structure. Yes, this will not allow me to obtain his implant in its pure form and understand the methods of working with magic. But in this regard, I am in no hurry. A research complex on a quiet and cozy remote planet will find out everything that is possible. Yes. Welcome back to the real world, Technomage Elric. Having waited for the scanning process to finish, I give the guest a life-giving and invigorating kick. Literally. With a quiet groan, the man began to stir, trying to understand what exactly had happened, where he was, and what exactly they wanted from him.
In some cultures, squatting down next to the man who has just opened his eyes, I say in an ingratiating tone, "Technomage Elric, an unprovoked attack on a high-ranking government official is punishable by death. Even in highly developed and enlightened cultures, mind you." The technomage, clearly still experiencing extremely unpleasant sensations after the shocker discharge, tried to crawl backwards. But as I have already told you, I am a very generous and friendly representative of my species. I do not think that for international relations, as well as for you personally, such a punishment would be particularly preferable. Therefore, I watch with interest the man's continuing attempts to make his body move again as it should. I think you will agree that a light lightning strike is far from the worst thing that could happen to you. How? Cough. Finally, the muscles began to obey, and Elric managed to assume a semi-sitting position, albeit still leaning against the wall of the cabin. Magic? I shrug with a smile. Or technology. Wonderful uncertainty, isn't it? Finish your tea before it gets too cold. It would be a shame to lose such a taste. What have you done to me? The technomage sat back down in his chair with visible difficulty, trying to hide the trembling of his hands while pouring himself another portion of tea. If I may say so, I smile even wider. I, figuratively speaking, slapped you on the hands. Well, and dissected you a little. What else could I do?
Dissected? The man swallowed, starting to examine himself and trying to make sure that all his body parts were in place. And did you think that when you woke up you would see me bending over your lifeless body in a bloody leather coat with a huge cleaver? Honestly, we are not barbarians. You're kidding. It's your right to think whatever you want. Elric sat silently for a while, trying to regain his composure and finally come to his senses. The still hot tea in his cup helped him with this quite well, and I was not going to force myself into conversation since the conversation had gone so wrong. However, I was not at a loss. The first information about the differences in the physiology and body structure of the technomage compared to an ordinary representative of humanity had already begun to arrive via the replicator network. And with each iteration of calculations and analysis, these differences became greater and they became more and more interesting and more promising. I apologize, Lord Baal. Elric finally breathed out, setting his empty cup down on the table. I apologize, and I hope that my unreasonable behavior will not have catastrophic consequences for the rest of my order.
Throughout our history, we have done our utmost to stay as far away from politics and serious events as possible. I hope that we will continue to do the same in the future. Your apology is accepted, Technomage Elri. I nod. Thank you for such a meaningful conversation and company over a cup of tea. Thank you. I hope that if the misunderstandings have been resolved, I can take my leave? Of course, I won't keep you any longer. Elric rose to his feet, still slightly twitching and uncertain movements of his hands, as he straightened his robe and making a short bow headed towards the exit of the cafe. Technomage Elri, a call out to the startled man already at the threshold. Yes? Don't forget to fix everything you've done in my terminal before you leave. Please. I finish my tea, looking sideways at the guest. Otherwise, you will see extremely fascinating and monstrously interesting dreams at night for the rest of your days. Are you familiar with the name Teletubbies? The technomage, whose face had fallen and who had become even paler, made several passes towards the device, and I watched with curiosity as the alien program code, which appeared in the vision of the replicator network as a long centipede made up of unknown symbols and intertwined geometric figures, crumbled into a harmless set of fragments, which a second later simply dissipated into the digital air. With a quiet rustle, the door to the cabin opened, releasing the technomage into freedom and closing immediately as he stepped out into the corridor. Interlude. Michael Garibaldi was sad. Not that his life was usually a non-stop rainbow party with balloons and fireworks and clowns, but he was sad. And sad. And he hated clowns. Not that was particularly relevant right now. For almost an hour now, he had been sitting on the floor of his cabin, leaning his back against the couch and melancholically unloading and loading his service blaster pistol. It looked like some kind of twisted meditation, but in reality he was solving an important and difficult dilemma. Should he shoot himself here and now, or not ruin the upholstery with his brains, take his balls in his fist and continue to pretend that nothing was happening as he had done for many years of his service on the Babylon? First, he was shot in the back by one of his employees, someone he personally promoted, someone he believed he could trust. But as if that wasn't enough, Michael could still understand if someone decided to shoot him in the head simply because of how much of a pain in the ass he was. Garibaldi was soberly aware that his character was not particularly friendly, his work style was not particularly gentle, and his innate paranoia could not be a positive quality at all. But this, his subordinate, became a participant in a conspiracy to kill the current president, a willing participant. The head of Babylon's security service himself could not stand politicians, but he could not understand such a spit in the back from a person he trusted. A beep sounded from the front door to the cabin. Someone wanted to talk to him. Yes, the man sighed. Come in. Mr. Garibaldi? The person who entered turned out to be the new station commander, Captain Sheridan, which was extremely unexpected for Michael. Captain? With difficulty straightening his legs, which were numb from sitting for so long, the man stood up to meet the guest. I was waiting for you to come see me, but in vain. Sheridan spread his hands, at the same time carefully examining the head of his security service and his home. So grief had to come to Mohammed. I'm glad that Lord Baal's treatment helped so well. I spoke with Dr. Franklin. He said that you are indeed completely healthy and can return to work. Is it worth it? Garibaldi looked away. What do you mean, is it worth it? Sheridan looked at his interlocutor in bewilderment,
but then turned his gaze to the blaster pistol, still lying on the table, and fell silent mid-sentence. I don't know if I'm ready to go back, and I'm not sure it's worth it. Do you need a security chief like me? Maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just quit. Perhaps. John nodded seriously, looking straight into the man's eyes. However, you and I live in a strange world, and simpler does not mean better, Mr. Garibaldi. John leaned over, picked up the blaster and carefully put it away in the belt holster lying right there on the table.
He had seen this look in soldiers more than once, lost. The look of a man who had suddenly and abruptly received a slap in the face from the universe and did not understand what to do next with his life, service, work, and so on. And he knew how to deal with such problems. At least, he hoped so. I've read your file. Sheridan walked up to Garibaldi and handed him the holster. Your service record is quite colorful, and that's putting it mildly. But with all your shortcomings, the captain stood opposite Michael, smiling slightly, but still managing to remain absolutely serious. With your character, your quarrelsomeness, you know Babylon 5 like your own cabin, down to the last storage room of the technical levels. You are respected by your subordinates and colleagues. They value you. And I would be a complete idiot if I didn't at least try to work together. So tell me, Mr.
Garibaldi, the captain raised an eyebrow questioningly. Am I an idiot? Or does the security service actually have a boss it needs? And one I could trust? As you said, Captain. Michael absent-mindedly twirled the holster with the blaster in his hands. I'm quite the character. If you decide to leave, Sheridan put his palms in front of him in a conciliatory manner. I will understand and will not judge you. But still, I will try to keep your seat vacant for as long as possible. Let me know if you decide to take it again, okay? Just not for too long. Having waited for Garibaldi's still uncertain but agreeable nod, Sheridan nodded with satisfaction and, putting his hands behind his back, slowly walked out into the corridor, heading off to his business. Here and now, everything that was possible had been said. It was not up to him to decide further, and John could only hope that Michael's decision, whatever it was right for all concerned. Damn it. I feel like the heroine of some stupid joke from centuries ago. Susan Ivanova, hissing in irritation, swaying along the corridor of the Babylon 5 embassy sector due to her broken leg and crutches. Drazy again. Because of these belligerent lizards, this week was likely to be in the top 3 most disgusting work weeks of her life. Massive Drazy fights around the station. Attempts to understand the situation and understand what was going on and why these aliens suddenly began to enthusiastically beat each other's scaly faces according to a schedule known only to them. And now another skirmish right in the council chamber, ending with a half-hour conversation with the Drazy ambassador on the station. By the way, he also wore one of those idiotic colored ribbons, a broken ankle, and a monstrous headache, from which even the painkillers for the leg prescribed by Franklin did not help. Good day, Madam Lieutenant, came the usually cheerful voice of the most annoying, though surprisingly the most adequate of all, ambassador on the station. Although, as I can see, calling him kind would be somewhat inappropriate. May I offer you my assistance? Lord Baal, and it was he, although he continued to smile cheerfully, causing Ivanova to feel as if she had eaten an unripe lemon, nevertheless looked at her with open sympathy and was quite sincere in his offer. Apparently, Susan did not notice that she was just now passing by the door to his cabin and the Goa'uld ambassador simply heard her irritated grumbling and looked out into the corridor. Although how could he hear her voice through a closed bulkhead? However, it was Lord Baal. Ivanova simply did not even want to think about him in advance, starting her thoughts with the questions how or why. It was safer for her mind, and more useful for keeping it sane.
Thank you, Lord Baal.
The woman shook her head.
All that can help me now is a glass of vodka, a handful of painkillers, and a bullet to the head. Then I hope the alarm clock in the morning won't wake me up right away.
I understand. The man shook his head sympathetically. I can't promise vodka and a bullet to the head. Besides, alcohol doesn't mix well with strong painkillers, as far as I know, but I can invite you for a cup of delicious tea. 15 minutes at the end of the shift are unlikely to have a catastrophic effect, and your leg wouldn't hurt to rest.
Perhaps you are right.
The woman nodded, shifting from one foot to the crotch, and slowly moved towards the open door to the ambassador's chambers. Normally, I would never accept such an invitation. After all, it is a violation of a hell of a lot of regulations and rules. But not today.
Nodding understandingly in response, Baal helped Ivanova settle into one of the chairs that stood on either side of the low coffee table by the wall of the cabin, and he himself began busily clinking in the kitchen corner, brewing the promised tea. However, judging by the smells hanging in the room, he was clearly not doing this for the first time that day. "If it's not a secret, Madame Lieutenant," the ambassador's voice rang out, "tell me where you managed to break your leg." "Oh, don't even ask. I heard from Dr. Franklin about some kind of unrest connected with the Drazi," Baal continued thoughtfully, "and you are just coming from that part of the level where their embassy was located." Okay, you guessed it. The lieutenant accepted the cup of aromatic steam from the owner's hands with a grateful nod, inhaling the aroma with pleasure.
I would never have thought that a civilization that went into space, mastered interstellar flights, made contact with alien races. Ivanova sighed sadly and paused for a sip of tea. I would never have thought that representatives of such a civilization could just beat each other's faces just because of colored ribbons drawn by lot. Baal sat down in the chair opposite, placing a tray with a teapot and a plate of cookies on the table. They have a tradition, the woman explained, wincing. Once in a certain period of time, they gather wherever they are, dump a pile of purple and green silk ribbons into baskets, and then pull them in turn. Whoever pulls out the green one follows the green leader. Ivanova was clearly mimicking someone. There was silence in the cabin for a few seconds, and then the slightly surprised but completely sincere laughter of the Goa'uld ambassador filled the room.
Lord Baal even put down his cup of tea so as not to spill its contents on his lap. "Are you serious?" the man finally exhaled, having stopped laughing. "A society without color differentiation of pants is purposeless? Unbelievable." "What? What do pants have to do with it?" The woman didn't understand. I thought you were from a country called Russia." "Well, yes, only from the Russian consortium. This country hasn't been called Russia for 200 years. "Well, yes," Baal shrugged. "Forgive me, I was a little mistaken. So, in your 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, there was a fairly famous film. What was it called?" The ambassador frowned thoughtfully. "No, even if you kill me, I can't remember. But it showed a society exactly like the Drazi. The position in the social hierarchy was determined by the color of the pants of a member of this very society. I would never have thought that somewhere in the universe there would be intelligent people who would bring this idea to life, albeit in such a perverted way." Ivanova could only shake her head. But just in case, she made a mental note to check what movie the ambassador was talking about. At first glance, it sounded like sheer stupidity. But she had already gotten used to the fact that in the case of Lord Baal, even stupidity could be useful. Which meant it shouldn't be neglected. Probably, well, at worst, she would just have something to watch in the evening before going to bed. When society has no purpose, society has a way. Folk philosophy. Interlude, somewhere on the internet. One of the thematic chats by interests. Neko Lover 999. "People, you won't believe what I saw. It happened. Catgirls really exist. Photos in the attachment." Otaku.
Oh, come on. The photo is a disgrace, and the ears are fake. What are you telling us here?
Oh yeah, there are so many photos here. If you scroll through the history, throw it away.
Maximus, where was this photo taken? Otaku.
It looks like some kind of passenger terminal, some kind of station or something. Anime forever. Well, maybe it's just cosplay? The costume, makeup, and background were added later in the editor. Yeah, a Babylon 5 cosplay party. Otaku. Why Babylon 5? Yeah. So there's a cafe in the parkery of the station. You can make out the menu, and the view from the window is in the background. Otaku. This only proves that the photo is fake. What was it taken on anyway? Is that a metal plate? Nekolover 999. Yes, I was there myself. This photo is really printed on a steel sheet. I just took a picture of it to post here. Otaku. Fake. Yamamoto.
Gentlemen, I can confirm that this is the absolute truth. I saw them too a few months ago when I was passing through on the Babylon. Otaku, how can you prove it? Yamamoto, so there is video from surveillance cameras. Datali nam pristformes quest de trade na moj linie. I begged some from the customs officers through connections. Yeah, damn it. The ears are moving. Otaku, the video quality is disgusting. With such a picture, even I can draw you Godzilla in a sauna. And even if the video is real, the ears are still most likely false. Look, you can find even worse ones for sale on the internet. Yamamoto. And I tell you, they are real. Alive. Guy with a pyramid has entered the chat. Guy with a pyramid. Let me join in. I have more photos of these lovely girls. I can send them to you in a private message for a modest reward. And who are you? Otaku. And for money too? Guy with a pyramid. It doesn't matter who I am. It matters what I have. Otaku. Pruft. Pay for photos. No way. If I'm going to pay, then only for videos. Guy with a pyramid. Well, I can do video, but it will be more expensive. You have to pay for pleasure. Yeah. How much? Damn it. That's a lot of money. Anime forever. Ban him.
It's obvious that it's a scam.
Okay. Here is one photo to tease you, but more only for money. They'll throw cakes at me anyway, if they find out they're being photographed.
I told you so.
Where is this? What a Midas dream. Solid goals. Yeah.
I don't care where. Girls eat cakes.
Let me clarify. Girls with ears eat cakes. Damn, the same ones as in the first photo. Is this really true?
I told you.
Damn, this news is just a bomb. They are real. And now I want to see it with my own eyes.
Me too.
Me too, damn. A round-trip ticket to Babylon will cost a pretty penny. Maybe we should chip in. It's decided. I'm starting to save up. Instead of a seaside vacation, I'll fly to Babylon 5.
Captain, Ivanova turns to Sheridan, who had entered the bridge smiling. You have received personal mail from Maynard, captain of the ship Cortez. A rather rude message, if you will allow me. The commander continued to smile broadly. On the one hand, reading the commander's personal mail was not very polite, but on the other hand, since it came through open channels and it was her shift and, well, in short, after the story with the Drazi, she was not in the best mood anyway, so it would be a sin not to raise it at least a little, especially since the text of the letter was indeed unusual. Rude? Sheridan took the plastic sheet from the commander's hands and began to read the letter with a satisfied look. Well, only if everyone calls you a swamp rat, sir. Ah, the captain laughed, waving it off. An old nickname. Someday I'll definitely tell you this long story. As I see it, the Cortez will be calling on us to replenish supplies.
Yes, Susan nodded. They already sent a list, and I must tell you they have quite an appetite. Well, what did you expect? John shrugged. They were in autonomous flight for several years. How many Pathfinder-class ships have come here? Not a single one as far as I can remember. Oh, then you're definitely in for an unforgettable spectacle. Commander, Captain, one of the dispatchers raised his head. They are already here. Request to open the transition zone. I advise you all to take a look, gentlemen. Sheridan turned to the bridge shift, then back to the observation window. If you're lucky, you'll see a ship of this class, twice in your life. Maybe 3. The next moment, the transition zone began to move. The trusses of the structure began to move apart, increasing the passage dimensions. A series of bright flashes ran along the guides, merging into one sparkling star in the center, and a huge transition funnel opened up near the Babylon, noticeably larger than usual. As soon as the passage stabilized, the Cortez began to majestically float out of hyperspace. A huge long ship designed to explore the far corners of space, establish first contacts with new alien species, and build new transition zones in those of the open systems that were considered promising. The Cortez was a class of ship that had the range to literally iron the galaxy from end to end, only occasionally stopping to resupply, all the while discovering new systems, making new maps, and refining old ones. And meeting it was truly an exceptional event, especially since the Babylon 5's commander had known its captain personally and for a very long time.
Иванова млеет честно метатры саркастики. Этар конята, что всевчаны стинки вопростаны неша. Тетре с греху лежи ноханя с милой выпердане по нашу. Ксерес. Пробрали ступоня Шеридан, полязный ярощный, сто манроха такая кортеса теская. Ех,
Джак лагдил из тамандроха. Хия, важе мою капумя. Шеридан салла какая карихаца. Все сарайт проедание тоталия. Ройстами и нардарте. Вашему крения сактория не на всотах. На сырмеши уже нови смогу стасиходя. Взбылирать сум не болит. Что я видусь старма плепа лактования. Рослища смирнаем Бабилон. Я сниваще принцали невашные суходища. Гляди по неме ужа. Сыром новый сторож шла умабалиния. Джак наже шеве.
We were simply turned off in the Euphrates sector to perform maintenance on their transition zone. While we were hanging around there, we had to do something to while away the technicians' time. That's where I found out. Well, since we still needed supplies, I decided that making a stop at Babylon 5 would be a great idea. Captain! Ambassador Delenn was heading towards the men, smiling broadly. Glad to have found you. Madam Ambassador. Sheridan, smiling back, gave the woman a slight bow, then turned to his companion. Jack, allow me to introduce. This is the ambassador of the Mimbari Federation, Delenn. The Mimbari bowed her head ceremoniously. Ambassador, this is my old friend Captain Jack Maynard. I'm flattered, Madam Ambassador. Maynard, who had been looking with some bewilderment at the woman's unusual appearance for a Mimbari, nevertheless pulled himself together and bowed back.
Captain Sheridan. Delenn turned to John, becoming a little more serious but still smiling with her eyes. I would like to convene a council meeting in the next few days. We need to discuss the situation in Sector 19. No problem, Ambassador. Send me the date and time and I'll definitely come. If necessary, I'll move other meetings in the schedule. Thank you, Captain. Delenn exchanged bows with Maynard once again and, smiling at the men again, walked further down the corridor with an easy gait. John? As soon as the Minbari ambassador disappeared around the corner, Maynard couldn't help asking, Is she Minbari? Yeah. She doesn't look like her. Well, I mean, she looks like her, of course. Jack gestured to himself to show what he meant, but not quite. What happened to her anyway? You haven't figured it out yet? We know her own version. Sheridan spread his hands. But you know yourself, the Minbari never tell the whole truth.
Well, I should know. Maynard could only shake his head, not forgetting to look at the interiors of the station, along the corridors of which they were walking. Yeah, what a farm you have. Not like a ship's backwater. Oh, come on, Jack. Sheridan laughed. A wonderful 8-kilometer madhouse. More surprises happen here every minute than there were on the Agamemnon in a year. I didn't think you'd ever get stuck at the station. Well, at least you're not bored. The Golden Pyramid outside alone is worth something. Sheridan rolled his eyes. Not boring, oh yeah. In the few days he'd been station commander, he'd been so not boring that sometimes he began to understand Mr. Garibaldi's recent musings in the solitude of his cabin. Sometimes I wish it were a little less boring, sighed Sheridan, inviting his friend into his cabin. The Narns and Centurions are at each other's throats and are only looking for a new opportunity to annoy their neighbor. Evolons have their own goals, which no one knows. What's more, I sometimes doubt whether Ambassador Kosh is inside his spacesuit, or whether this co-track can move around the station itself, and the ambassador relaxes in the jacuzzi in his cabin. The Minbari authorities hated me an hour after arriving at the station, and Ambassador Delenn, she even went into hibernation in some kind of cocoon. I'd better just keep quiet about Lord Baal. And I've only listed the first day in Jack's new position. The first day. How are you coping? Maynard laughed, shaking his head and accepting the bottled juice Sheridan offered him. I'm not making any plans for tomorrow. The Babylon commander shrugged. Yeah. What time dust was, John? Maynard grinned sarcastically. I was thinking of having a drink with you, somewhere on the edge of the galaxy, admiring the great void. You wanted to go on a long-range reconnaissance mission.
I wanted to, John sighed, but when the president asks and the chief of staff gives the order, it's hard to refuse. But why appoint someone to the position that Mimbar will immediately hate? Well, I try to please them so that they don't grind their teeth too much. And how do you like it here? By and large. After all, this isn't really your specialty. I don't know. Sheridan sighed again. I guess I can be useful here, perhaps. Although I didn't expect such a seasoned space wolf to get stuck behind a desk. Well, the table, however, is quite nice, as is the view from the window. Captain Sheridan saluted Jack with his glass. But in any case, Jack, it's up to you to tell the story. Even I on the Agamemnon didn't see as many new places as you did on your Cortez. So go ahead, Tell me what's going on out there, in the far reaches of space. What's going on there? The same thing over and over again. Routine. And what? Nothing unusual at all?
There are so many tales and myths about deep space, John.
The captain of the Cortez thought for a second. But you know, there's something interesting. You've probably heard these stories that hyperspace can be inhabited? Habitable? Sheridan frowned in confusion. Well, I mean, of course I've heard, ever since boot camp. You can count on your fingers those who don't believe these tales, but you don't mean to say that… No, I don't believe that hyperspace is inhabited, but… Jack shook his head. There is definitely something there, so alien to everything we know that it's impossible to imagine. I've seen something myself, John. Saw? Well, to tell the truth, it wasn't in hyperspace. In general, a lot of strange things happen in deep space. Don't drag it out, Jack. I am not dragging it out. Maynard chuckled, taking a sip of juice. I went out on a boat with Lieutenant Patrick. We were doing reconnaissance. We moved far enough from the Cortez. It was no longer visible. And? I was about to turn back when suddenly I saw something, literally out of the corner of my eye. You can't even tell the distance, a black blot on a black background. I only saw it by the way it blocked the light of the stars. I can only say that it was simply enormous. I had just turned to Patrick to ask if he saw the same thing, when something simply disappeared, as if it had dissolved into a vacuum. This is the second time in a month that I've heard of some kind of devilry going on in the outer worlds, Sheridan frowned. That's what we do too. The navigator noticed something too, but even less than me, some kind of flickering, nothing more. So I have no idea what it was, but it's definitely there. Brrr, Maynard shuddered. When I remember, it gives me goosebumps. Well, I wish I knew exactly what the hell is going on there. Well, if I weren't me, I would definitely say what exactly and where the designer of the Pathfinder-class ship compensated for. The Cortez was impressive, even by Gua'uld standards, being almost 6 kilometers long, a sort of flying club with rotating sections strung on it, which housed the main crew quarters and technical storage facilities with materials and machines for assembling and servicing the transition zones. The most massive elements, of course, were spread out a little further along the hull, but the ship was so impressive in any case that I was even ready to forgive it for the outright disgusting design. Utilitarian ships had the right to look any way they wanted after all. Their main purpose was to complete the assigned task, and not all this. But it wasn't only the arrival of the Cortez that was the reason for my cheerful mood. Oh no, not only. Technomages. Fucking technomages. One of whom recently had such an expressive tea with me.
The information obtained after scanning Elric's body turned out to be extremely promising. It was worth starting with the fact that their entire, organization was essentially a product of ancient replicator technology. Having carefully analyzed the data obtained, they concluded that with a probability of 87.45%, their abilities are the result of applying the technological achievements of the Shadows. Yes, with an adjustment for the small scale of the user. Yes, with the obvious antiquity of execution for the replicators. But nevertheless, technomages were created by the Shadows. Period. All their abilities came from an organ technological implant located along the spine and partially entering the host brain. The replicators had already begun to synthesize a copy of this implant separated from the body in order to understand the principles of its operation in more detail. But even at the earliest stage of research, it became obvious that I had hit a gold mine that only the great machine on Epsilon 3 could surpass, and only due to its time manipulation capabilities. Energy source. Two simple words that mean a lot to any civilization, and an incredible amount to a civilization that understands the value of this energy and what can be done with it. And the replicators were precisely from the second category. Even during tea, the sensors in my cabin on the Babylon noted that all the spells created by Elric were fed by a source unknown to me, located however somewhere in his body. But in a human body, even modified by shadow technology, it simply could not concentrate in such quantities. And here the miracles began. At first, I even didn't believe my eyes, forcing the replicators to run the tests again to be absolutely sure of the conclusions obtained. MNT 0-point module, a magic pill for the energy crisis for everyone who wants it? No, of course, it was not a ZPM in the direct sense of the term, which was put into it in the native world of my body. The technologies were completely different, but the basic principles and ideology of the process are a completely different case.
The Technomages implant received energy from somewhere simultaneously outside and inside, and based on the information stored in Elric's brain at the time of the scan, the Technomages themselves called this place nothing other than null space. The Order had long tried to understand the essence of the ongoing process, but all they had come up with, or all Elric himself knew about, was to understand that the shadow implant drew energy from some other dimension, more energetically saturated than the ordinary world. Yes, all this was still incredibly little to shout Eureka and run around in circles in ecstatic ecstasy, but
The replicators definitely knew how to reverse engineer, and I had virtually unlimited time and could afford to conduct any, no matter how thorough, research and experiments. Because the results were worth it, the adaptation of technological chains to the local analog of Naquadria, Quantum 40, already completed by the replicators, and the potential opportunity to gain access to virtually inexhaustible energy sources in the form of M&T technology, all this opened up incredible opportunities for development. Interlude. After seeing the Cortez off after replenishing supplies, Sheridan felt out of sorts the entire next day. Once again, his old friend, doing what he loved, showed the man that somewhere in his life he had clearly taken a wrong turn. Yes, he was a career naval officer and had no way to influence on a global level his working life. The command orders, he carries it out, but that didn't stop him from thinking.
He was more than sure that if he asked Maynard, the captain of the Cortez would gladly find him a place on the crew even if John resigned. And this fact drove the man into even greater depression. To sit idly on a station, albeit huge, but tied in space, to be de jure a naval captain and de facto a fucking governor of a small provincial town in the deep ass of the world, despite the fact that Babylon 5 was in fact a diplomatic and trade center of the sector, but this fact only made things worse, adding a huge amount of boring bureaucratic routine, like resolving diplomatic disputes between representatives of two civilizations, one of which, you see, is not happy with the location of their cabins relative to their neighbors, because the second are corpse-eating Pakmar, and the wind carries their stench straight to the first.
And no one cares that there is simply no wind on a space station, and all the cabins are hermetically sealed and have a separate system of ventilation, purification, and regeneration of the atmospheric volume. But no, John. Sit down and sort out the complaints, John. Sheridan caught himself thinking that he was no longer listening to Ivanova, who was reporting on that very problem with the Pakmar, but was simply mindlessly sorting through the pile of documents and tablets on his desk. Sir? Yes, Commander? The captain sighed. Can I be frank, sir? The woman looked closely at her commander, clearly suspecting that something was wrong. Yes, Commander. It is possible. Sheridan forced himself to put aside another tablet and looked at his deputy. Ever since the Cortez arrived, and ever since you saw Maynard off on another raid, you haven't been yourself. Maybe you need to talk to someone about this. My profession.
Sheridan rose from his chair with a sigh, starting to pace the office. My profession is to manage starships, not cities in space. The man waved his hands around the space, pointing at the Babylon around him. All this bureaucracy, the little things, all these complaints about trifles, quarrels between diplomats, endless talk in the council. Jack Maynard was right. This is not what I was taught. This is not what I was prepared for at the academy. I will soon choke in this routine. The captain angrily crumpled one of the plastic sheets on his desk and threw it back. Ivanova could only silently watch the commander rushing about, letting him speak out. Even if she disagreed with something in his words, Susan understood perfectly well that everyone sometimes needs to let off steam, especially if this anyone was in charge of the greatest diplomatic dump in the history of mankind. Look at my desk. I can't find a thing in this pile. The man looked sadly at Ivanova.
You know me. Tell me, is this like me? Captain. But there is plenty of bureaucracy and minor problems on starships too. You've always maintained iron order on the Agamemnon. Yes. The Babylon has its own peculiarities, its differences, but you also settled crew disputes on the ship. So forgive me, but there's clearly something else here. Something you're not telling me.
Maynard is right. John fell back into his chair. I was basically written off to the shore.
But I don't agree. Ivanova stubbornly objected. The station commander requires no less. and sometimes much more energy and intelligence than the captain of a starship, no matter what class. But there is one fundamental difference. I was turned into a bureaucrat, into a politician. The captain almost spat out the last words. They were so saturated with disgust.
I will say this. If our tailed ancestors had known that politicians would descend from them sometime in the future, they would never have climbed down from the trees and banned evolution. Damn it.
Sheridan threw away the stylus he was clutching in his hand.
The spacious skull did us a disservice. President thought you could handle it, Captain.
Ivanova knew she was using unfair methods, but she couldn't do anything about it.
As your deputy, I have the right to ask. Was the president wrong?
I don't know. Maybe so, but
It didn't become clear right away.
silence reigned in the office. In truth, although Sheridan believed that he had been put in this position for nothing, something inside, something after Ivanova's words, out of sheer stubbornness, told him that even if he was not the person needed here, there was no way he would just drop everything and run away like an indecisive cadet before his first exam.
Managing a huge station full of alien diplomats, each of whom would not mind spitting in the compote of their neighbor and blaming someone else for it, was not an exam at the academy. Definitely not. But John was no longer a simple cadet.
Okay, the man sighed, allowing a slight grin to creep onto his face.
Change the delegation's cabin, smooth the snitch's feathers. Yes, sir. Ivanova nodded, rising to her feet with slight reluctance and leaning on her cane. True, they don't have feathers, but I understand you, sir, the woman smiled. I'll do everything. That's great, I'll go for a walk, I think. If you need me, I'll be on the bridge. Casting a hateful glance at the piles of paperwork on the table, the man straightened his jacket, shoved his hands into his trouser pockets, and taking a deep breath, headed toward the elevator. There were several ways to get to the Babylon Bridge, so why not the longer one, right? Captain Sheridan had almost reached his destination. He was literally 2 turns away from the door when the transmitter on his hand beeped with an incoming call. Sheridan speaking. Transmission from Cortez. This is a distress signal. Your mother! The man cursed, practically running onto the bridge, miraculously not hitting one of the shift workers. I'm here! Turn it on! This is Cortez. Transmission. Emergency. Navigation system. Homing beacon not registering. Disorientation. Hyperspace. Requesting assistance. Assistance! Over! The huge amount of interference made the signal almost unreadable, but it was still possible to understand the main thing. Maynard's ship was in trouble. Losing orientation and the homing beacon signal in hyperspace was tantamount to the death of the ship. Getting out into normal space without ending up at the opposite end of the galaxy or in the center of some star, without knowing your location, was absolutely impossible. If the ship was fully operational, the captain could risk and exit hyper in the hope of getting his bearings on the spot. But even in the case of a fully operational vessel, it was a lottery with odds of success worse than Russian roulette. Turn off the speakers. Clenching his jaws until they cracked, Sheridan waved his hand at the dispatcher. Continue recording the signal. Maybe something else will break through the interference. Give them the answer. Signal received. Help is coming. Transmit continuously. Yes, sir. Commander. The man turned to Ivanova. Gather all pilots free from flights in 20 minutes. Sir, you know that not a single ship lost in hyperspace has survived. I know. The captain gave his deputy a dark look. I'll gather everyone who's here. Ivanova nodded, staggering toward the elevator, calling out to the squadron commanders as she went. I assume Commander Ivanova has already explained the situation to you.
Captain Sheridan paced back and forth in front of the 3 pilots lined up before him, and it wasn't easy for him to say what he was going to say next. The officer soberly understood that even the idea of searching for someone in hyperspace was an incredible adventure, and trying to find a lost one, a malfunctioning and probably damaged ship that couldn't even give the direction in which it was drifting from the nearest homing beacon? From the Cortez message we know for sure. Only one thing. The ship is flying blind. The commander rightly pointed out to me the fact that no one has ever been rescued from hyperspace. But I intend to try. How far have they gone, Captain? One of the pilots called out. Unknown. The message said that they had lost their homing beacon, and we were unable to locate the source of their signal from our side. Too much interference from hyperspace. In addition, each subsequent message received becomes more and more illegible. They are related.
Yes, Sheridan nodded.
And they're moving away from us. Time is very short. But if we can't locate the ship, how are we supposed to find it? One man spoke on behalf of the pilots. but the captain knew he was expressing everyone's opinion. There's one option. Very risky. John looked around at those present with a heavy gaze. Not written down in any rules or regulations. I will be frank with you. I cannot guarantee that by sending you there, I will be able to return everyone back. We know about the gravitational currents in hyperspace. We know that they can drag a drifting ship to the opposite end of the galaxy, if not further. But the Cortez has retained at least a partial ability to maneuver. It will be able to maintain its coordinates for some time. So, let's try to turn to the experience of our ancestors.
In ancient times, back on Earth, Ivanova joined the briefing. If a ship was wrecked near the shore, rescue boats would go in a chain in search of surviving sailors. The first fighter will remain right at the transition zone, only after entering hyperspace. The captain continued, in order to clearly receive the signal from the homing beacon. The second will fly off 1,000 kilometers and will be guided by the signal from the first, and so on. And the last one will continuously call Cortez in the hope that they will catch the signal and be able to respond. The young pilot sighed. If the ship is still too far away, sighed Sheridan, we'll have to stretch this chain, like a telescope. The chances of success are slim, but it's their only hope. Any questions? No, sir, came the discordant but unanimous response from those present. Thank you, gentlemen. John smiled. An old friend taught me an ancient Egyptian parting word. May God shield you from evil in the unknown where you step. Bring the Cortez back, and good luck to you. The pilots began to disperse to carry out their final pre-launch checks, and the two senior officers could only give them a couple of tense looks. I would give anything to fly with them. Sheridan exhaled heavily. Me too, sir. 5 minutes later, as planned, a squadron of Babylon 5 fighters took off from the station's service docks and headed in tight formation toward the transition zone. Women's logic is a license agreement. I don't understand anything, but I have to agree. Folk wisdom. Interlude. If someone were looking in the right direction now, not being busy with their important human affairs and preparations for an urgent flight, they still would not have noticed a large black cat with two tails sitting in a practically motionless silhouette behind one of the boxes, which were abundantly placed in the fighter service area.
Behemoth, the cat. And it was he, watched with an attentive cat's gaze the pilots who quickly ran into the dock, sat down in their machines, and having waited for the station dispatcher's command to take off, headed off to rescue the lost Cortez from the depths of hyperspace. The cat was curious and interested in literally everything that was happening around him on this huge steel barrel, dangling in the orbit of Epsilon 3. Having made sure that the docks were practically empty, leaving only the duty shift of service personnel, the cat silently jumped off the box and with an independent and completely self-confident look, raising both tails, slowly headed towards the exit of the compartment. The station in the last 2 days was literally seething. The overwhelming majority of the thoughts of the inhabitants, read in the background by Behemoth, were devoted to the brief arrival of a huge research ship, rare even for more advanced civilizations. It was easy and interesting to read the intelligent ones. God tried to avoid only the embassy sector, so as not to even accidentally meet in thought with the Vorlon ambassador Kosh. His personal and individual self-esteem told the tailed telepath that he could cope with him, but a small amount of uncertainty, mixed with the lack of precise knowledge about the potential enemy, still outweighed the adventurous note of his character. Having made sure, including telepathically, that there were no unwanted witnesses around, the cat sent a request via the replicator network to activate the teleportation module, the next moment disappearing in a short flash of the transfer beam. Yes, he had told Lord Baal that he would use the teleport if he needed to quickly avoid trouble, but what could be more unpleasant than having to stomp on all fours from one end of Babylon to the other? Yes, that's what he would say if he was asked about such behavior, definitely. Although, something told him that Lord Baal would be the one who wouldn't be against it, no matter what. The teleport beam transferred the tailed telepath to one of the walking park paths of the station's recreational zone. Stretching his entire body, the cat shook himself and walked with a relaxed gait where his eyes looked. And his eyes looked in the direction of the nearest cafe, where fresh seafood was served. Well, as fresh as they could be on a space station located millions of kilometers from the nearest planet with seas and products extracted from these seas.
Oh, how lovely. Where did you come from, Kitty? As one sly, clever cat expected, as soon as he appeared in the line of sight of the establishment, stylized as an earthly Japanese cuisine, one of the waitresses, who at that moment was relaxing on a bench near the back door of the restaurant, immediately noticed the unusual guest. What are you doing there, Zoe?
A colleague called out to the waitress, looking out at the voice.
A black cat just appeared out of nowhere. Look, Deck, even with a collar.
The first waitress squatted down in front of Behemoth, who looked phlegmatically at the girl carefully leaning closer to him to examine the pyramid hanging on the collar.
No way! Try bringing pets to Babylon!
Well, come out and see for yourself.
Holy shit.
Rebecca, aka Beck, stared in shock at the telepath, who, at that very moment, took a couple of steps forward and playfully butted Zoe in the knee with his head, making a bass but melodic purring sound.
How lovely. But it's not a cat, Zoe.
The girl said uncertainly.
Why did you decide so?
Cats don't have two tails.
The hippopotamus, having decided that it was time to move on from simply petting the cat to something more productive, used the most reliable weapon that any member of the feline family possesses, regardless of what genus they belong to. He made the pleading eyes of the cat from Shrek and purred questioningly, looking straight into Zoe's eyes. He probably wants to eat. Beck, let's treat the cat to some fish. Zoe, are you crazy? A cat that came from nowhere, who is not a cat at all, on Babylon 5, where the devilry does not happen only in the dreams of the inhabitants. Just look at him. What the hell? Well, two tails, big deal, but he's definitely hungry. The girl scratched Behemoth behind the ear and, jumping to her feet, ran off somewhere inside the establishment, leaving Rebecca alone with an unknown creature.
And the creature, meanwhile, behaved exactly as any self-respecting cat should behave. With an unperturbed look, he sat down right in front of the girl and began to wash himself, looking sideways at her with a green eye, as it seemed to the waitress, with an extremely malicious expression on his face. Here, eat it, cat. Zoe returned with a small bowl containing finely chopped pieces of fresh salmon, usually used to make sashimi. Literally spreading into a contented cat smile, Behemoth walked around the girl, rubbing his side against her, and with a quiet bass purr began to eat the offering. Having gobbled up the treat, the cat walked around the girls again, purring loudly, and then briefly twitched his ear, using the capabilities of the replicator network to make the Babylon computer believe that a small amount of tips had been transferred to Zoya's account. Behemoth, of course, was impudent like a cat and was incredibly proud of it, but still, he was a decent impudent cat and not some kind of street punk. Still, where did he come from? Zoe said thoughtfully, seeing off Behemoth, who was busily heading off along the path. All Sheridan could do was wait. He would give anything to go with the rescue team, but Ivanova was right to leave out the fact that it was a hell of a risk in itself. Sometimes it was worth letting other people do their job. The fighter pilots knew their stuff, and if it was even theoretically possible, they would bring his friend's ship back to the station. Maynard's ship's SOS was unstable, often jammed with interference, but the main thing they did was that Cortez received a message from the station that they were being followed, received and heard, and that meant that now, even with an unstable bearing, the fighters would be able to find the ship.
But the wait dragged on incredibly long. Minutes followed minutes, and there was no good news from the search team for 3 hours. The dispatcher was steadily receiving reports every 10 minutes, but so far the fighters had not managed to find the ship. Even with a bearing on the distress signal, it was incredibly difficult to search for something in degenerate space. Maybe you should take a rest. Sheridan, who was tensely pacing the bridge, turned to Ivanova. And you, sir? The commander answered John with the same tense look. But I can't, the man sighed, turning away to the observation window. Jack is my old friend. I have to be here. I have to do something. Or at least remember him, if I have to. Was it he who taught you the Egyptian parting words? He. John smiled slightly involuntarily. He was my first commander before the war. Back then, it seemed to me that he knew everything in the world. Damn it. And that's how it was. Captain Maynard knows that any flight is always associated with risk. What can we say about a long-range autonomous flight on the Pioneers? Ivanova shook her head. If it comes to a wake, I will be there and drink with you. But until then, just repeat the parting words. Jean smiled gratefully at his deputy, sighing with some relief. The commander's words hadn't solved the problem, but the knowledge that he wasn't the only one forced to think about what was happening still helped the captain. It was nice to know. Request for transition zone. Ships are approaching. The dispatcher suddenly spoke up, jumping up from the terminal. How much? Ivanova turned around tensely. 4 signals. The transition zone activated, unfolding from a bright spark of energy into a glowing blue funnel of hyperspace exit. And the next moment, ships began to emerge from it, one by one. First, Fighters 1, second, third.
Із прожудзёнтаў з краіх боленце і саполілення абіралі житями із коженка, тому вага робіджуєщі. Кортес, дісіс Вавилон, Шеридан проносі скарута. Жеридан трона диво із после. Шеридан грозди бафличила биоакостит систей, ветивши леоорзячные. Кортес, если правлими сошествуя племя ситуеми из люны. Занеся держидио сесущно сая, змей за к нему безмажня. Шеридан не было вот така ситуирис на поблении ощи поклучи. Жебе что есте, ливаните. Жеридан гожды поличнее не мажу. Кортес, жом разальный общениюнся штатычный глитый. Глан, вини из ранее. Аксазы зазнесяете зарежленная к шипяк пополичная, леону не была. Гланная чай слити, вещь лити, и леону и награя. Лиски сничи, долже сочнем ралижа, без алии. Шеридан нахалижен с кразнанцы. Это зняется шея блона. Шеридан, сиводушие блот. Запросное прыжание ветеши чистой. Общелина е преужащий Кортес. Шеридан трозной ночести вытеклирует. Кортес, Jesus, visually undamaged, but clearly having some problems with the engines. За идеей. Жеридан нужует охли Коперна. Глан, вини из раней. Жеридан розды пополичня. Запросной мужи не зайте ржения. На кострине харбыву в описании. Шеридан запросный. Растринее полични. Рашидениацион. Шеридан гузний сошнин проблем поплей за Кортес. Кортес виде и сине. Да я стон нердеть. Глан, вини из рани. Истроти на поличне анкрели. Едон из иски мири. Да знаен месоши. Едон зашноши. Жеридан истроши. Глан, вини из рани. Кортес виде и сине. Изличена поличне. Глан, вини из рани. Жеридан дрозды пополичне. Глан, вини из рани. Дор засвачнатычный. Глан, вини из рани.
Sheridan, perhaps this characterized him from a better side than he thought about himself, but it didn't make it any easier. Nodding to Ivanova, the man walked slowly towards the exit from the bridge. For almost 20 minutes, Sheridan had been standing in one of the corners of the Battleon Park area and simply staring straight ahead, running through the recent events and his decisions that led to them in his head over and over again. Could he have done something differently? Could it have helped bring all the participants of the search operation back? Or maybe? Unfortunately, he had no answers no matter how he looked at it. The decision to send a flight of fighters to locate and find the Cortez was the only one that gave at least some chance of success, and the probability of losses among the pilots was impossible to predict. Captain? Ambassador Delanne's quiet voice came from behind Sheridan, causing him to turn around. Excuse me, if you wanted some privacy, I can come back later.
No. Sheridan smiled slightly. Please, come in. I heard about what happened. The woman looked down sadly. Please accept my condolences. There's probably nothing harder than this.
John caught himself thinking that he was glad the ambassador had come, glad that there was someone to talk to, someone who wasn't part of the station's crew, sending people to their deaths and staying on the sidelines himself. They saved the others. Delenn looked straight at the captain with a soulful look. They were there when it counted, and they knew what they had to do, just like you, Captain. Am I in the right place? The universe, Captain, Delenn smiled, is choosing a place for all of us, a place for spiritual growth. It is not easy there, but it is always the right place, the proper and necessary. So, wherever we are in the right place at the right time.
And pain? Dooman spoke with the confidence of a rational person who clearly knew what she was talking about. Is an inevitable part of the process of constant rebirth. It seems we are having similar thoughts, Ambassador, John muttered in surprise. Perhaps. The woman nodded smoothly. It seems we are both at a crossroads, Captain Sheridan, but the universe is never wrong. I wish I had your faith in the wisdom of the universe. The man shook his head. Sometimes it is very difficult for me to imagine it. I will tell you a secret, Captain. The Minbari turned to the man with a smile. The greatest secret is the molecules that make up your body, the same ones that build this station, and the distant nebula, the same ones that burn in the depths of the stars. We are the universe, Captain. The universe trying to understand itself. And, as we both realized, sometimes the universe needs to look at things from a different perspective.
Thank you. The captain smiled gratefully at his interlocutor for the first time today, truly. Captain, the signal of an incoming call from the communicator and Ivanova's joyfully disbelieving voice made the man shudder. Another fighter has returned, just past the transition zone. What? The man exchanged a distrustful glance with Delenn, who continued to smile. This is Lieutenant Keffer, sir. Incredible. Delenn, pleased with the change in the captain's mood, bowed, still smiling broadly at the man, and walked smoothly about her business, not wanting to distract the officer from the work issues that he now had to, and most importantly, could, deal with. Even the most self-confident, intelligent, most decisive and capable sometimes needed support from the outside, and Delenn, being a member of the priestly caste, understood this better than anyone.
It was amazing, but the fact was that with each day that Korone and Yuki spent together at the station, plundering the supplies of local confectionaries and driving their waiters to nervous tics, I increasingly came to the conclusion that the girls' personal matrices were developing. Korone distinguished herself in this regard the most, but her little sister was also successfully catching up with Neku in this field. And if at first I thought that I had missed something important in their program code, now I was no longer at all sure of it. All possible checks that I could perform on the already written code showed that the original matrix was, if not ideal, then at least had the right to claim it. Emulation of emotions, the part responsible for the sensation of taste, allowing Neke to enjoy the taste of cakes, tea, and other goodies. But then, some misunderstandings began. More than once I caught myself thinking that Korone's behavior went beyond the code embedded in her, even taking into account any possible self-development. The girl showed emotions. I felt through the replicator network that she truly enjoyed talking with Yuki during their joint get-togethers in the cabin or in the cafe, and the second Neka reciprocated her feelings, although with somewhat less intensity for now. And the most interesting fact was that this development of the code was not justified by anything. In the best tradition of Alfred Lanning, who understood robotics firsthand, I was ready to admit in all seriousness that there were always ghosts in the machine. Fragments of code that were completely understandable individually, but which, when filed in one place at one moment in time, led to the formation of completely unforeseen algorithms and protocols. Tell me, Korone, I thoughtfully transmit over the replicator network. What is your relationship with the darkness? I don't quite understand you, came a surprised answer from Neki.
Are you drawn to Yuki in an empty room? Do you want to be closer to her? Lord Baal, is your code finally everything? An emotion of serious worry, almost panic, was transmitted through the replicator network. And with the slightest delay, literally a tenth of a second, a similar package of emotions came from Yuki. My sister was also worried about my mental state. Or, are you kidding me? For the first time in my memory, Korone climbed into
my area of the replicator network, and looked at the course of my thoughts that preceded the question asked. Until now, I had not blocked her access there, did not forbid her to watch and listen. But the girl usually ignored this opportunity, even in those moments when she accused me of inconsistency and absurdity of actions. But now Nika was really worried about my behavior. The questions asked went beyond all the boundaries of her concepts of absurdity.
I'm not making fun of you. I'm doing research. So will you answer my questions?
Of course not, because they don't make any sense.
I like being around Korone. It's interesting to talk to her, Yuki answered instead of her sister.
Don't answer him, Yuki. He's just making fun of me.
Korone grumbled, tossing the second Neka packet with information about the source of my questions and their background. But Yuki gave off an emotion of uncertainty, complete with slight embarrassment.
I really do like our get-togethers with cakes, our conversations, and it's uncomfortable to be in a dark room, even though I know there's nothing like that in the dark. You see, Korone, your sister loves you, and you behave like this. And anyway, I'm witnessing the birth of mythical female logic. Don't stop me from enjoying it. What? Women's logic? Now a wave of complete misunderstanding came from both necks. Well, I considered the option with a soul. I mean with a psycho-emotional shell, in a metaphysical sense. But I like women's logic more. Definitely more. You are impossible. I clearly heard an irritated snort from Koronye, but at the same time a serious sense of relief came from both girls. Lord Baal was found to be sane. Yes, eccentric. Yes, illogical and extremely, extremely strange, but sane. At least, no more insane than usual. The results of the study could be considered valid and required further observation and testing. Who knows where the development of the creatures I created will ultimately go? But I clearly felt your anxiety, and you can't deny it. Did you know, Neka said thoughtfully, suddenly changing the subject, that in 45% of cases, intelligent beings who die a violent death were personally acquainted with their killers? Now I don't get your train of thought. Maybe I should check your code already? It's simple. The girl was clearly smiling contentedly. The more sentient beings you communicate with, the more there will be who want to kill you. Perhaps in a particularly perverted way. Although, personally for you, I would deduce a statistical value of 93.415%. And the remaining 6.585%? I ask with genuine interest. Getting shot by random people and interacting with the inhabitants of Babylon 5. They are incredibly patient and intelligent. If I were Commander Sinclair, I would throw you out the airlock an hour after meeting you. Am I being trolled? Openly, with the most complete and sincere enjoyment of the process. And with full awareness of what was happening, including the fact that I understood perfectly well what Korone really meant. It's amazing. You do understand that threatening to brutally kill your own boss is vulgar, right? In response, another snort, and an emotion of feeling superior came from Neki. No, the girls were definitely developing, by leaps and bounds. But even the emergence of independent personalities with personal desires and behavior patterns practically did not change their attitude towards me. Of course, healthy, unhealthy paranoia dictated that I become extremely suspicious and attentive, especially after the creation of a self-learning AI with access to the technologies that the replicators had. But what replaced my intuition told me that everything would be fine, probably. However, no matter how the process ends, it will at least be interesting to observe. In any case, there were simply no particularly urgent matters at the moment. The replicators in the labs continued to dissect the samples of alien technology and genetic materials that I had received, literally taking them apart into atoms and analyzing how exactly they worked, where they got their energy from, and how all this goodness could be used for the greater triumph of the silvery spiders and their master in the person of my humble self.
There had been no news from the probes sent to explore degenerate space for a long time. I mean, the news from them was just the standard routine reports on the relative distance traveled, anomalies detected, and ships of other types detected within the sensitivity limits of their sensors, but it turned out that if the local hyperspace was inhabited, then its inhabitants either knew how to hide very well, or there were so few of them that the chances of running into them in such spaces differed from statistical error only by the difference in terminology. And let's be honest, there were still not enough probes for such large spaces. However, this project was not my main one, but rather pursued the goal of satisfying curiosity and some sporting interest. Although even in this mode of operation, the sent research modules brought some useful information.
Thus, on the very border of my domain, already more in the intergalactic void than in the Milky Way galaxy, the replicators discovered one modest star system, only miraculously not thrown out of the galaxy by gravitational forces and not losing its planets over the past thousands of years of its existence. On one of the planets, which at present were a bare stone ball, without the slightest sign of water, atmosphere, or any living matter. Nevertheless, extremely ancient ruins were discovered. Most of the complex was located deep in the planet's crust, and therefore was practically undamaged by time and the cosmic cataclysms that unfolded in the system. At first, having just received a packet of information from the probe, I, frankly, was quite tense. The architecture, the incredible preservation, coupled with antiquity, and the underground occurrence of the ruins, made the site eerily similar to the creations of the race of space zombie terminators, well known to a certain circle of people. At first, and to be on the safe side, I even sent 5 Ketaks to this system for control. But the planet was dead at all possible scanning frequencies. There was not the slightest source of energy in the entire volume of the planetoid, at all. Just dead ruins of black stone with greenish veins on a dead planet in a dead star system on the very outskirts of the galaxy. Among the buildings, there were not even any traces of inhabitants left. The past millennia and the events that accompanied them reliably erased any traces.
Of course, I did not remove the fleet from the system, you never know, and sent a full-fledged research complex to the planet to study the buildings and search for possible artifacts. But the most interesting thing was that the sun of this system was a neutron star. Tiny, only 18 kilometers in radius, but incredibly massive object was practically indistinguishable from a long distance, but potentially was an extremely useful resource. It was from neutronium that the nanites that made up my replicator body were created. Of course, not directly pure neutronium from a neutron star was firstly incredibly radioactive, half-life period of about 10 minutes, and secondly, absolutely unsuitable for any manipulation.
However, humanoid replicators in the home world of my body, over tens of thousands of years of forced isolation in a bubble of slow time, not only evolved, but also developed an entire technological chain for processing this material and creating on its basis extremely durable, almost indestructible, and energy-intensive replicator blocks. And now, I had a decent supply of this material. Lord Baal's hamster was incredibly pleased. True, I still didn't fully understand what to use all this stuff for. Besides, the process of processing neutronium consumed an incredible amount of energy, so all potential projects using it were postponed at least until the bright moment of finishing the research of shadow technologies received from the Technomage Elric. But as they say, a reserve does not weigh down the pocket.
In addition to the neutron star, the probes discovered another 24 alien civilizations, which were in various stages of backwardness and therefore did not present any particular interest, and one ancient empire, which was clearly already living out its days. The species that created the state were intelligent insects, most reminiscent of terrestrial wasps. In the distant past, they apparently owned a decent number of star systems, as evidenced by the abandoned bases and extinct colonies discovered by the scouts. And they were also a rather warlike race with a huge fleet by the standards of any other intelligent species, clearly of military purpose. But at some point, something went wrong. At the moment, the vast empire has shrunk back to the home system of space wasps, with a small number of observation posts outside of it. It seems that the main reason for the decline was a simple and banal problem of loss of interest in development.
The wasps lived in a rather deserted corner of the galaxy and simply did not have a chance to reach other developed species during their expansion. And then something happened that theoretically can happen to any sufficiently developed civilization. There are practically no problems with obtaining the benefits of civilization. External enemies have not been detected, and internal ones have faded away on their own. What kind of continuation of development is there? The find caused some melancholy, but I did not touch the old man, although at first there was a temptation to stir up the remains of their empire.
showing that they were not alone in the universe. But this decision did not bring any benefit at all. The technology of the wasps, like the overwhelming majority of species of this world, I believe was built on organics, and their ships were genetically programmed and grown in giant living shipyards, giant wasps without legs and wings, not needed in space. So, all that was left was to sigh sadly, shrug and fly on, making a note for the future to visit another ancient monument if the opportunity arises. Interlude. The officer's tavern was crowded, but unusually quiet. Funerals are always very sad, but such is the harsh truth of life. Now in the establishment were all the pilots of the Babylon, and many from the Cortes, who also came to honor the memory of the squadron commander, who gave his life so that they could escape from degenerate space. To Commander Gallas, the best commander I ever served with, Lieutenant Keffer, looking ahead with a detached expression, raised his glass into the air. For Gallas came a discordant chorus from those present, who also raised their glasses in memory of the deceased pilot. For a few seconds, silence reigned in the room. Everyone experienced what had happened in their own way, remembering the deceased and thinking about the transience of life.
Lieutenant, Ivanova finally said, what killed you? What did you encounter there? It's Adas. Having seen the object a second time, albeit only for a moment, I thought, what if it was on the same course relative to the transition zone? The recordings of the first observation were preserved, and then the computer worked. But what it was? Keffer shook his head. I have no idea. Just a clot of darkness and a feeling as if someone had walked over your grave. Meeting with the unknown. Captain Maynard, who was standing nearby, said thoughtfully, such things are never forgotten. But what was that? Some kind of ship? I don't know, Keffer exhaled irritably. We'll probably find out someday, Susan sighed. But now is not the best time for wild hypotheses. Lieutenant, the woman turned to Warren. I understand that the moment is not very good, but the squadron needs a leader.
I recommended you. Congratulations. Jack Maynard patted the pilot on the shoulder encouragingly. Can you handle it? Ivanova looked at Lieutenant Keffer with a careful glance. I think so, ma'am. Warren sighed, straightening up and nodding in agreement. Okay, the commander nodded in response. Then rest today, and tomorrow we'll deal with the paperwork and your new assignment. And yes, Keffer. Yes, ma'am? You are great. Thank you, ma'am. They have the Titanic and we have a baby mammoth on an ice floe, and it survived. And all because we shouldn't have fucked in the hold but rather looked for Mom. Author unknown. The more information about the technologies that I inherited from the replicators, the greater the prospects opened up. The source of energy for the Technomagician implant really was something similar to the legendary MNT, with the only difference being that the MNT was, in essence, an ordinary battery. Yes, it was high-tech. Yes, it twisted the laws of classical physics known to people on the reproductive organ. Yes, it was capable of destroying a medium-sized star system if used incorrectly or in a potential explosion, but it was still a battery, a disposable energy source of limited capacity. Inside the classic MNT, there was an artificially created region of space with different from the usual laws of physics. In particular, it had a much greater energy saturation of the vacuum. And the device, according to the principle of its operation, simply pumped out this extra energy from this pocket bubble, giving it out in a certain mode. As soon as the energy supply ran out, the pocket dimension collapsed, and the MNT turned into a beautiful paperweight. The creation of shadows was closer to a full-fledged power plant.
Each implant of Technomagicians had a personal broken communication channel with one of the many parallel dimensions, from which it drew energy for the spells they used. Having only Elric's example before my eyes, I could not say whether the channel of each individual Technomagician was unique, leading to a separate space, or whether the shadows simply found one energy-rich place and pulled energy from there. But in any case, if the space at the other end was comparable in size to our universe, given the density of the transmitted energy, its reserves would be enough for an entire army, not to mention a handful of Technomagicians.
It is curious, but even with such energy supply capabilities, and I will tell you that the ability to produce even 1% of a ship-caliber salvo in the dimensions of a human body is a very good capability. In the shadow reconnaissance ship studied by the replicators, there was a much simpler and more understandable, although quite powerful for this class of ships, energy source. There was nothing supernatural or incredible. Either the shadows over the past years forgot the technologies that allowed them to create technomages, or the creation of these power supply channels was extremely labor-intensive, and their use in each ship was simply unprofitable. Having come to this conclusion, I made a note to myself for the future to check this idea if a shadow ship of a more serious class falls into my hands.
In any case, the most important result of the research was the simple and magnificent fact that, despite its organic nature, the physical principles of the technomagician implant were quite clear to the replicators. And that meant that, even if not immediately, even if only after a series of tests, they could reproduce these same effects on their technological base. Perhaps this was the first time in my entire stay in this universe when the technology that fell into my hands truly brought new opportunities for improvement, and self-improvement, among other things. The first thing I did as soon as the laboratory complex decoded Elric's genetic code and received an information copy of the spherical technomage in a vacuum was to give the command, already tested on cats, to begin growing experimental specimens. Artificially grown living beings with different combinations of organism parameters, for each of which a copy of Elric's implant was grown and placed in its proper place.
Of course, this process took place in conditions of complete isolation, in order to avoid even the theoretical possibility of transmitting some emergency signal from the implant to its original creators, the shadows. It's not that I was particularly worried about their attention. After all, they hadn't even reacted to the missing scout yet. But in such important and promising research, no precautions are superfluous. Against the background of technomagic technologies, even Dr. Franklin's device for manipulating life energy did not look so tasty, although of course it had its undeniable advantages. The artifact, created by an unknown alien civilization, like almost the overwhelming majority of highly developed technologies of this world, belonged to the technology on an organic element base. Replicators found in the device structures similar to those found in the Ship of Shadows. However, given the narrowness of the sample, this did not mean, by and large, anything specific.
The technologies themselves were radically different, which is quite expected for the products of the technology of two completely different civilizations. As Dr. Laura Rosen correctly translated, the artifact was initially used by its creators as a tool for carrying out the highest measure of punishment, that is, execution. Neither the female doctor nor I fully understood why such a highly developed civilization, and according to estimates, they should be even more developed in some ways than the Mimbari, would need such a primitive device. But what happened was what happened. In fact, the fact that the device could be used to heal was simply a side effect of its original purpose, discovered after its creation. In some ways, the artifact resembled the gold sarcophagus in its effect. During operation, the device produced some kind of radiation that interacted with living organic matter.
The key difference was that this radiation connected two living beings, worsening the general condition of one and simultaneously improving the second, potentially leading to the cessation of any metabolic processes of the donor. In addition to the general tone of the body, the artifact, as in the case of Goa'uld devices, could heal diseases and injuries, returning the recipient to the ideal state prescribed in the DNA structure. If the replicators do not discover additional features in the future, the find was of no particular value to me, except perhaps as hamster food. Otherwise, the same sarcophagus was superior to the artifact in all respects. And now, Dr. Franklin, I say thoughtfully, waiting for the medic's tired face to appear on the terminal display. Good evening. I hope I haven't distracted you too much. Good evening, Lord Baal. Stephen rubbed his eyes, blinking and straightening up in his chair. Just a lot of work. Did you want something?
I've finished examining your device.
You'll find him in your cabin by the bed. The man looked at me in surprise. All the best, Mr. Franklin. I smiled, giving the command to teleport the box with the artifact to the place I named. I follow with my eyes how a thin beam of light striking from the ceiling transports the alien device and thoughtfully stroke my beard with my fingers. Where can I get a sample of Vorlon technology for a complete set? Something tells me that Ambassador Kosh will not appreciate it if I pinch off a piece of his ship's spacesuit and energy material shell. And yes, I am repeating myself in my thoughts, but the thought is definitely worth pondering.
and waiting for a convenient opportunity. Interlude. The frigate Calvados,
A prototype ship of the Earth Commonwealth, created using technologies donated by the ambassador of an alien empire from another galaxy, waited patiently, hovering at some distance from the transition zone of one of the backwater mining systems. Lieutenant Edward Prendick sat in the first pilot's chair with a satisfied smile on his lips, leaning back on the comfortable back. Captain Sheridan's order to go and slaughter pirates was a balm for the soul of one of the best pilots of the Academy. Yes, de jure, he was listed as the first mate of the ship's captain, and the frigate had its own pilot, but no one could forbid him to let his subordinate rest and take his place himself. Edward loved to fly, although in the last couple of years, such happy moments did not happen often. Lieutenant, the ship's sensor array operator, called to Prendick. A flurry of signals.
Just as the Babylon reported, they're clearly going to wait here for the next ore transport, hoping to make a profit. Excellent. Edward smiled, smoothly lowering his hands to the control handles. Let them come to a distance of confident destruction. Another signal, larger than the other, sir. Prendick frowned for a moment, punching out a few commands at the helm terminal and peering closely at the sensor readings on the display. The operator was right. After a dozen signatures matching the readings of the old generation patrol corvettes, a massive ship of an unreadable class slowly floated into the field of view of the sensors. Usually, such ships were used by large pirate gangs as mobile bases. Edward knew how it was done. Several decommissioned ships were bought on the black market, usually the same corvettes or transports. Then they were assembled into a single structure in underground shipyards, hung with additional armor and weapons that could only be obtained. And voila!
The love child of an aircraft carrier and an orbital base is at your disposal. The speed characteristics of the resulting Chimera were not the highest, but the ship was armored, incredibly capacious, and to be completely happy, it had the ability, in case of extreme need, to disintegrate into several separate modules and literally fly apart in all directions. It seems that this flight will be extremely fruitful. Let's see what they do next. Lieutenant Prendick drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. The pirate aircraft carrier was hovering at some distance from the transition zone, obviously as a last resort, and smaller ships were scattered around the coordinates of the funnel opening. Such awareness and preparedness for ordinary pirates made the lieutenant frown.
Someone was clearly leaking information to them, and this someone could equally well be among the employees of the mining company developing the planetoids in this sector of space, or among the dishonest politicians who had a share of the pirate spoils. Radio transmission from normal space to the main pirate ship recorded. Duration 4 seconds. Unable to intercept the channel is encrypted. Excellent. Readiness number 1. Edward, without turning around, punched out a series of commands on the console. On my command, rapid fire at the small fry with missiles. Then we work on the main ship. The main thing is not to let them escape. The bridge crew reported readiness, and the Calvados's bridge observation windows reliably hid behind the advancing armor plates, transferring direct visual observation to the external cameras. A wave of combat alert swept through the ship's rooms. Focusing on the upcoming battle, Edward smoothly moved the frigate's wheel, sending the Calvados forward. The black hull of the prototype frigate reflected light extremely poorly, especially in the conditions of degenerate space, where the only sources of this light were the black-crimson shimmers of the surrounding space. So the crew of the warship took full advantage of the surprise effect. A swarm of missiles had already managed to fly off the guides in both hemispheres of the hull, and the enemy fighters and corvettes had only just begun to reorganize to repel the new enemy. A battle in a space vacuum and the degenerate space of hyperspace in this sense differed from a vacuum insignificantly, was not at all spectacular, contrary to how it is shown in feature films and described in literature. Short flashes of explosions, occasionally accompanied by instantly extinguished clouds of multicolored flame. That's all that happens during explosions in space. But for the pilots of the ships, of course, it doesn't make it any easier.
Not all of the missiles fired by Calvados found their targets. But the rapid fire is rapid for a reason, so as not to aim for 100% defeat. The frigate's salvo destroyed 2 enemy corvettes and several fighters, forcing the rest to scatter, leaving the possible line of fire and trying to surround the larger, but, as they believed, less maneuverable frigate. Avoiding return fire, Edward sent the Calvados into a spiral flight along a complex trajectory, preventing the pirates from firing accurately. The carrier only now realizing that they were under attack, began to pick up speed, clearly feeling that it was in a winning position and intending to destroy the enemy. Without waiting to reach close combat range, the aircraft carrier launched another dozen fighters, which immediately scattered and began to surround the frigate, and then from the guns hidden behind armor plates and in the depths of the jumble of hulls, a series of shining flashes from pulse gun volleys flew towards the Earth ship. Some of them were intercepted by the guns on the Calvados hull, most of the rest passed by, dissolving in the abysses of hyperspace, and a few of the remaining ones successfully hit Edward's ship, leaving melted craters in the massive armor plates. But the main thing was done. The frigate came out to the range of aimed fire and made a return salvo. From under the contours of the hull, 4 thick ruby-scarlet beams hit the enemy ship, confidently began to cut through the armor and plating, causing bright, albeit short, flashes of explosions along the hull of the pirate ship.
Edward Prendick's lips were twisted into a wry smile, like a man enjoying a perverse pleasure. The long-range detection system terminal signaled that signal of unknown origin had been detected in the sensitivity zone. Commander Ivanova frowned and ran her fingers over the keyboard, trying to determine the source of the signal and the distance to it. What was surprising was the fact that the signal had come from a completely unexpected place, from a direction practically opposite to the location of the transition zone, and it came from ordinary space, not from degenerate space.
"What's there?" Sheridan called out to the woman. "A weak signal from deep space was detected," Ivanova reported. "From far away? Not from hyperspace?" "No." Susan pulled up the data on the screen, showing it to the commander. "And it doesn't match any of the communication frequencies we know of that are in use." "A new race?" The man raised an eyebrow in surprise.
First contact cases were certainly not unheard of. After all, they were stuck on a diplomatic station millions of kilometers from Earth, and a couple of levels away, hundreds of alien races of every kind lived there. Still, there weren't that many species unknown to humanity in the explored part of the galaxy, and every new discovery of one of them was definitely a significant event. "No, sir." The commander shook her head. "The computer just loaded their message. It's a voice recording. Here, listen."
This is Copernicus. We come in peace.
A pleasant female voice came from the speakers, occasionally interrupted by light background noise.
This is Copernicus. We come in peace.
The message was repeated cyclically, and the voice on the recording clearly spoke English, which made this find even more interesting for the station's crew. Copernicus. Sheridan scratched his temple. The name is definitely earthly, but I don't remember such ships. Me too, but we'll see soon. Ivanova pointed to the telemetry, to the source of the signal. We can already send our probes so that they can lead this ship to the station. They'll reach it. Let's go, the man nodded. But be careful, we don't need any surprises. Susan nodded with a serious expression, giving the command to the automation and sending a dozen small flying drones to the source of the transmission. It took quite a long time to wait for the results. After all, Copernicus was at the very edge of the system. But after 40 minutes, a picture from the camera of one of the drones appeared on the screen. Copernicus really was a ship from Earth, only very, simply incredibly, old. The hull of the starship was worn out, even in the generally accepted emptiness of space. Any object that had been in a vacuum for a long time was subject to many aggressive influences.
These included the smallest dust particles, micrometeorites, and aggressive radiation from nearby stars, and the materials themselves simply evaporated in a vacuum, like water in a glass on a hot summer day, only incomparably slower. The skin of the Copernicus, which had once clearly been well assembled and fitted, was now completely eaten away by corrosion. Some structural elements, such as protruding antennas or trusses for suspended equipment, were completely missing. It was simply a miracle that at least something capable of continuing transmission had survived. Otherwise, the ship would have simply flown past the Babylon, whose sensors would have taken the object for ordinary space debris, not attaching any importance to it unless it posed a threat to the station, with the possibility of a collision. U.S. Space Fleet. Sheridan read the inscription on the ship's hull, located along with its name. USA, so he's from Earth. I've never seen such ships.
I think. Zhang's eyes showed a vague recognition. You should look in the history books. Ships like this were used before we even heard of jumping into hyperspace. From the Centauri. It's been a long time. What wind brought him here anyway? Who knows? Sheridan shrugged, looking with interest at the relic from the distant past. Maybe it didn't reach the required acceleration, or it went off course due to the incorrectly calculated gravity of one of the passing planets. Since then, it's been hanging around in space. Incredible. Look, Captain. Susan brought up the results of a more thorough scan, carried out by the drones carefully towing the Copernicus to the Babylon. There is someone alive on board. How is this possible? Bring him to the dock. Sheridan to the medbay. John, with an inspired smile, activated the transmitter. Franklin speaking, came the medic's tired voice. Doctor, send the medical team to the 4th airlock. They will probably have an unusual patient waiting for them. I understand you, a frankly tired, heavy sigh came from the communicator and the doctor disconnected. What's wrong with us, Captain? Mr. Garibaldi walked quickly onto the bridge. I've already got psychos running around the Zocolo. This doesn't bode well. Psychos? Sheridan raised his eyebrows. Yes, there is one here, a station idiot from the lower levels. Oh, Michael pointed to the Copernicus feed from the probe cameras. So that's it. Do I need to prepare for something? I've already sent Franklin there, the captain shrugged. There are weak signs of life on board, so… Got it. Garibaldi nodded businesslike. I'll take my men and go check it out. I suggest we all go. An anticipatory smile appeared on the station commander's face. You do realize how many rules this breaks, right, Captain? Ivanova shook her head disapprovingly. But you are with us, aren't you, Suzanne?
The head of security asked ingratiatingly.
Of course, I'm with you, Michael. The woman snorted and, ignoring the puzzled looks of the station dispatchers, headed for the elevator first. After exchanging glances, Garibaldi and Sheridan chuckled in unison and followed the commander, catching up with the woman already at the elevator. Up close, the Copernicus was no less impressive than when the welcoming delegation entered the dock. They were literally greeted by a breath of antiquity. Right from the threshold, it became clear that this ship had been built on Earth and had been built a very long time ago. It was most similar to the typical transport ships currently used for cargo transportation by almost all transport companies, of course if you make allowance for its more awkward appearance. The absence of cargo containers on the external suspension and the impossibility of flying in hyperspace. Mr. Garibaldi was the first to approach the ship, as expected, leaving 2 employees he had brought with him to carefully monitor the situation from the entrance to the dock, and placing another one to the left of the entrance to the ship. Surprisingly, the massive metal door of the entrance airlock opened almost effortlessly, producing only a drawn-out grinding sound that made everyone present shrug their shoulders from the unpleasant sensations. Turning on the flashlight, Michael took out his service blaster and carefully entered inside, listening and almost sniffing the surroundings. Inside the Copernicus, it was cramped. Even in modern ships of the utility class, all the space was given over to pragmatism and efficiency. What can we say about a ship that came from the very beginning of the space age? A small corridor led 3 officers to another hatch, which also opened almost effortlessly, behind which was the main and only room of the ship. What is this? Garibaldi shone his flashlight on 2 massive frost-covered boxes that stood in the middle of the room and took up most of the space. These are audacious chambers, Ivanova said in surprise. I've seen some like that in the museum, but these seem to be in working order? It looks like it. Franklin thoughtfully walked along the row of terminals and ancient computers placed along the walls and continuing to blink rhythmically with their indicator lights, showing that the ship was still alive. The system reports a critical failure in the right capsule. The doctor pointed at it with the beam of the flashlight. But the left one should be fine. Yes, it is its inhabitant that is showing signs of life. Franklin, checking the medical scanner in his hand, walked over to the second capsule, wiping the frost off the glass of its lid.
Inside the audacious chamber, there was indeed a human being, a pretty young woman, who now looked like she was sleeping peacefully, which was completely normal for being in audacious. What is this? Sheridan pointed to the suddenly changed rhythm of the indication on the cover of the chamber. She's dying! Franklin frowned, quickly running the scanner along the sleeping woman's body. Perhaps we violated something by opening the compartment. Or the camera was already on its last legs. But then she was just incredibly lucky. We need to get her to the medbay immediately. Help me! With the combined efforts of Franklin, Ivanova, and Sheridan, they hooked the frozen lid of the capsule, pulling it up. Suddenly, as soon as he lifted it slightly, a dense stream of icy steam hit the medic's face, which in the next moment dissolved into the surrounding air.
Having recoiled at first, Stephen could only look back at his colleagues in bewilderment when the steam disappeared, as it had not. And there was no time for reflection. Neither he nor his patient had. Two medical workers, who had come with Franklin, ran onto the ship, unfolding the gurney on the go and preparing for transportation. Master, a message came from Behemoth over the replicator network. I thought you might be interested. The telepathic cat sent to eavesdrop and peep mostly just collected rumors, brazenly using his cuteness and open access to the teleportation module. But in this particular case, the information from him was curious. To begin with, Babylon detected a nation spaceship in its immediate vicinity. I received this information directly from the station's computer, among other things.
Даруза там просто наймен свешнову шрежетка йо нове, петвжому єрба, которую гозне петасу чи місурі прийме. Міші жданду жаз добраджана в'єтна окрамка. Behemoth na pańdarmi na chepek, przezanca pije psajskan. Różat, zdanie berondia je z luni. Bropa, przyżone przyszczyten sprawa, zapotań sekyło Copernicus. Jaskardałe gotąstcach to kriszja dysanten. Prowa, jast poza populiczerze wastałżona jest krywian. I reżylit, żarze wukalaki, kiperoznew nalia muszmicząca rozmi, tylko na stamie burja przekto. Enerzją ma to na wprot wodę jana za której okanu. Jadałany minbari, ja bugowane klice ja dergrzin rugierto. Na takre, jagodna nie usimi enerzjo. Ubijen starane i osoby partigono klija jenomian min konflikto. Ja z posmu, zejnie grejne jana negoła janienka juszando. Alien, freebie, take it! The replicator sensors, which I had long ago scattered throughout the station's systems, recorded a weak surge of energy at the moment of its exit from the body of the girl in suspended animation. The unknown creature was weak. In fact, if I am not mistaken in my estimates, it was on the verge of hunger fainting from exhaustion. But there were many sources of electromagnetic radiation on Babylon, not counting the station's inhabitants, the organic matter of whose bodies it could also, it seems, somehow use. Curious. I transmit the emotion of approval to Behemoth. Will you be able to track him down at the station? It would be possible to organize a search by energy radiation, but I'm afraid there would be too much interference from surrounding sources. Besides, you remembered the imprint of his consciousness. I knew you'd like it. I'll track it down. The cat literally radiated pleasure. If I'm not mistaken, in one of Mr. Garibaldi's chambers, there is a homeless person who believes that he has seen this creature before and can sense its presence. I recommend using this person to increase the effectiveness of the search. Great. Smiling contentedly, I leave the cabin, heading for a walk around the station, simultaneously preparing a cozy room for the energy guest on the hut dock on the other side and finding information about the person designated by Behemoth in the Babylon 5 databases. Of course, an alien will not replace a Shadow or a Vorlon, but sometimes you can practice on cats, especially since it was still necessary to somehow get to the representatives of the two ancient races, preferably in such a way as not to unleash an interstellar war on two fronts. Not that this was a particularly critical problem now, but why do I need an extra headache if it can be avoided?
The walk brought me to a small rest area in the Sokolo, where local visitors usually stopped for a snack or a refreshing drink in the middle of a shopping trip. As always, this part of the station was very, crowded, with people of all races and cultures milling about, stopping at small food and drink outlets, chatting with each other or just sitting in a corner, tensively staring into space. Good day to you, Mr. Franklin. I bow with a smile to the doctor, who, by an incredible coincidence, found himself right there, arm in arm, with a young girl unknown to me, who, judging by the data from the Babylon database, had recently been discharged from the medical bay after rehabilitation after a long period of suspended animation. She was documented as Maria Cyrus, and was currently looking around with all her might, only miraculously not shying away from the representatives of non-human species passing by.
To her credit, Stephen did not rush his companion, patiently supporting her by the arm and allowing her to simply come to terms with the fact that she had missed a huge period of time, literally falling out of what was happening and not even understanding how she should react to what she saw around her. Good afternoon, Lord Baal. Stephen bowed briefly in response. Will you introduce me to your companion? I suppose it is she and her ship that are the subject of rumors throughout the station. Rumors? Maria looked from me to Franklin and back, uncomprehending. I don't understand. Forgive me, for God's sake. Franklin was embarrassed, turning to both of us. But we live here as if in a large village in the middle of the forest, if I may be allowed such an analogy, and the Copernicus was seen by many random people. You are right, Lord Baal. Let me introduce. This is Maria Cyrus, a passenger of the Copernicus. Nice to meet you, Miss
Cyrus. I smile, deciding to join the doctor's explanations. As one wise man said, forgive me for some rudeness of the wording. There are plenty of shitty clairvoyants on Babylon, and it's quite problematic to hide something interesting here. Clairvoyance? Well, maybe not literally. I shrug. So far, I have not met anyone among the aliens who could have the ability to see the future. I emphasize the words with quotation marks, or to learn about events that they did not personally witness. If I am not mistaken, this is how you, humans, understand this word. Ah, Maria clearly latched on to my distancing from belonging to humanity. Aren't you a human? Oh, forgive my manners. I bow again with a repentant look. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Baal, Lord Baal, if I address you formally, and I am the authorized ambassador of the intergalactic empire of the Goa'ulds on the station Babylon 5.
Well, you know, I smile frivolously, waving my hand. All these boring meetings, high politics, and other bureaucratic niceties. But you look like a human, Maria frowned. Oh, I sigh, rolling my eyes but still smiling. Mrs. Cyrus, if you only knew how many times I've heard those exact words and with that exact intonation. I don't understand. Forgive me if I offended you in any way, but no, you didn't offend me at all. It's just every reasonable person asks this over and over again. Why do I look like a human being without thinking that everything could be quite the opposite? You mean? The girl opened her eyes in amazement, looking at me incredulously. Judge for yourself. I shrug, once again voicing my opinion on the topic under discussion. Our empire has many hundreds of thousands of years of technological and social development, and the species itself is much older, so who should be like whom, to be honest?
Sorry. Forget it. I wave my hand generously.
Dr. Franklin, wouldn't your patient do any harm with a cup of good tea and some cakes? I think she's a little tired from your tour. Oh, you're right. Franklin quickly and professionally looked over his companion, noting her increased pallor, unsteady gait, and the way she persistently held on to his elbow. Centuries of suspended animation, although it allowed one to literally travel in time to the future, were not particularly beneficial to the human body, especially if the suspended animation chamber was very old and imperfect, and the awakening did not quite follow the proper procedures. Let me treat you both. I gesture to the people to the nearest cafe. While maintaining a simple, polite conversation, I note with a second stream of consciousness that something strange began to happen in the cell with Amis, the same tramp whom Garibaldi detained.
Am sensors replicators разобрят Марсдел сварзи простикатумус тватка. Не может предзвуря. Не уния половача. Амис не може бяйце паскаялані подсила. И знатя, девратя, сдаїствай і брядь зіят браграні порними, посвоята прощемения, пи дверы сиварцу и прикати, которые не вы себяются с сублиннее коридерные, жи и малоннее от могом. Звали менее бродицыни, репликаторис зайси правлице, саманы вселы, на Таркузан подумрацем хаборнис в Эвандразе, та на...
Watching what was happening through the sensors. Although I did not have a visual picture, I still received information reflected in my vision as a pulsating silhouette consisting of many electromagnetic fields overlapping each other. The creature leaned over the dead Drazi, and his body began to dry out right before our eyes, as if shrinking in on itself. Curious. The creature is energetic, but feeds on material organic matter? An additional curious aspect was the fact that I could not teleport this creature from the station to the Huttak. The teleportation module simply did not recognize it as an object available for transfer. There were several possible solutions to this problem, but I do not think that the disappearance of an entire level, and literally, and not due to an error in the plans during construction, will be to Captain Sheridan's taste.
So for now,
I limited myself to simply observing and detailed scanning, and the new pet can be picked up a little later when a suitable carrier is ready for it. Tell me, Lord Baal. Maria, who was already looking much better after a cup of hot sweet tea with cream cake, but still felt unsure, turned in my direction with curiosity on her face. Yes, I smile. How is this even possible? I mean, I see the station around me. The girl hesitated, gesturing with her hand. I see representatives of many alien civilizations, but they are all so different from us, from people, and you are not. How can this be? Well, I smile. First of all, you haven't met the Centaurians yet. To an uninformed observer, they look exactly like people, if you don't delve too deeply into biology and medicine.
Yes, Franklin laughed. They, I remember, even tried to pass off Earth as their ancient colony, lost in the vastness of the galaxy. But it didn't work out. That's in the spirit of Londo. I nod my head in agreement. So, and secondly, our empire has many thousands of alien races, the appearance of many of which is difficult to even imagine. And among them there are several that are quite similar to humans, including the so-called double species. I think Dr. Franklin can tell you about such a phenomenon in much more detail if you want. The doctor nodded affirmatively. I mean that the universe is incredibly large, Mrs. Cyrus. But even with all her boundless imagination, there are overlaps. I shrug my shoulders. Perhaps in a million years, it will turn out that you, as funny as it may sound, are a forgotten colony of Goa'ulds, only unlike Ambassador Molari's fantasies, in reality.
Or perhaps we flew to your planet many thousands of years ago and started the process of evolution in some invertebrate fishing the ocean to see how it would end. In addition to official diplomatic missions, we also organize tourist trips. Although with your pyramids, of course, I still feel a little awkward. What's wrong with the pyramids? The girl clutched the cup convulsively, taking a sip of the cold but still tasty drink. Don't bother your head, I smile good-naturedly, waving my hand. You've already been hit with too much unexpected news in the last few hours, and the universe can wait. It's in no hurry. And the pyramids. Yes, this topic is definitely not worth raising at lunch. How awkward. Finally, Dr. Franklin finally admitted that his patient needed rest, not emotional overload, and the couple took their leave, leaving me alone with the remains of tea and sweets. I don't trust people who don't like animals. Author unknown.
Did you see him, Lord Baal? Jacquard emerged from behind the column like a ghost as I stood up from the table and headed towards the elevator. Ambassador Jacquard? I turned to Zenarn with curiosity, my whole appearance expressing bewilderment. Creature of darkness, have you seen it, Lord Baal? I have seen a lot, Ambassador Jacquard. I smile. But for the sake of our dialogue to be more productive, I gesture for him to join me on a walk. It would be nice to get a few additional comments, to understand what exactly you are talking about. Oh, the Narn smiled guiltily. Forgive me for being so forceful. It's all from excitement, I guess. That ship that was discovered and brought to the station quite recently. Are you talking about Copernicus? Yes, exactly, Copernicus. You just had a conversation with the girl that Dr. Franklin saved from this ship. Don't deny the rumors on Babylon 5 that there is an additional news channel on the network. It would be strange to deny the obvious. I shrug. Mrs. Cyrus was indeed one of the passengers of the Copernicus. As far as I know, from rumors. I move my fingers in front of me. The second passenger unfortunately died. Exactly, but that is not the point, Lord Baal. You probably do not know, but in our galaxy, Jacquard spoke with his usual fervor, there are many species, and some of them sometimes go beyond common sense and logic. I have spoken with many ambassadors of League worlds when I tried to clarify this issue for myself. The ambassador periodically lowered his voice when random sentients passed us in the corridor. And if you put aside the differences in culture, all of them have legends about the coming of darkness. Darkness? I thoughtfully stroked my beard. There was nothing fundamentally new in the ambassador's words for me. By darkness, the local races obviously most likely understood the shadows and their allies, who were notably thinning out the worlds during the next sandbox showdown with the opposite side in the person of the Vorlons and company. The only curious thing was the fact that without any reliable information about Maria, Cyrus and Copernicus, rumors that were surprisingly close to the truth suddenly began to appear among the inhabitants of Babylon. That's what many of the ambassadors call them. The forces of darkness act secretly through representatives of other races,
There are legends in the Narn culture about an ancient war in which the forces of darkness were defeated. They scattered across the galaxy, hid in secluded corners, waiting for the right moment. And you think, Ambassador, that these forces of darkness have returned now, here to the Babylon, to the Copernicus? I look at the Narn with some skepticism, urging him to continue speaking.
I don't think that, Mrs. Cyrus is that very creature. Jakar shook his head. But in any case, when such alarming information comes from such different sources, the ambassador spread his hands, we must take it seriously. However, the man sighed, I'm already beginning to understand that you have not personally encountered this horror. Luckily for you, Lord Baal. I've encountered many stranger things, Ambassador Jakar, I smile. Stranger enough to know that you don't have to take the rumors of the coming of the great darkness at face value to be prepared for it. But in this case, you didn't see anything, the ambassador persisted. Ambassador Jakar, I smile, is a simple human girl who found herself very far from her home and native time. Mrs. Cyrus can be anything or anyone, but she is definitely not a soldier of darkness. I emphasize the words with my voice. And I am more than sure that Captain Sheridan will cope with any problem on the station if it arises. You and I have absolutely nothing to worry about. I hope you are right, Lord Baal. Jakar just shook his head. I hope you are right. In any case, thank you for your time, and I apologize for interrupting some of your business. Having made a polite bow, the Narn, still somewhat worried, headed towards the nearest elevator from the level. Extremely curious, how did the younger races find out about the creature that had arrived at the station as a stowaway? His fresh lunch had only just been discovered, and it was discovered by a member of Babylon's security service, which immediately complicated the spread of rumors. The station's crew members, especially in Mr. Garibaldi's fiefdom, were not particularly chatty, an effect similar to the Vorlons' intervention when they wrote their image into the consciousness of the processed younger races. Perhaps.
But this still needs to be verified when our guest takes his place on the dissecting table.
Interlude. Michael Garibaldi tried unsuccessfully to sleep. Usually the man did not complain of problems with insomnia, but lately it had been surprisingly hectic and full of events. First, Copernicus, who appeared from the abysses of space like a ghost on Halloween, then the inexplicable death of the Drazi, which brought thoughts of damn mysticism, and also poor Amis rested in his cell, scaring passers-by with his apocalyptic predictions. In general, intuition and paranoia, having united, confidently did not allow the head of the security service to calmly suppress the pillow, forcing the man to restlessly toss and turn over the latest events in his head, trying to understand which of the many important details he could have accidentally missed, how to understand what was happening, and what to do with this whole situation in general.
Realizing that he clearly would not sleep that night, Michael irritably threw off the blanket and began to put on his uniform. After spending a few more minutes to tidy up his appearance, Michael washed himself with the coldest water possible and, regretting that he had nowhere to get a couple of liters of real black and strong like his belief in the benefits of paranoia, coffee, sent himself towards the block of cells for the temporary detention of lawbreakers.
So, come on, Amis, get up. Immediately entering the right cell, Garibaldi almost affectionately, as much as possible for a sleep-deprived person, woke up the prisoner. You know, from your personal file, it follows that you are not all there. The doctors still haven't come to a unanimous diagnosis. Amis groaned and sat up on the bed. Some called me a schizo, and some considered me a prophet. Do you want me to believe you? Michael asked, unexpectedly seriously, looking at his interlocutor.
Yes.
Amis was so surprised that he finally woke up, nodding his head convulsively. Then let's go to where you saw what you saw. What? Right now, Amis. Garibaldi handed the man a piece of cloth that served as a scarf. He had no choice but to nervously nod his head and, swaying sleepily, move toward the exit of the cell, feeling the attentive gaze of the head of security following him on the back of his head. As much as Amis wanted to run away and hide, he realized that, firstly, Garibaldi would easily find him in any, even the narrowest crack of Babylon 5, and secondly, he could not forget about the creature that had flown to the station, the creature whose presence Amis felt with all his guts, especially the part that had once been eaten by this creature. It didn't take long to walk, and after 2 elevators, a couple of corridors, and 10 minutes of travel, the men found themselves in one of the not particularly populated levels of the lower part of the station.
Generally speaking, according to the drawings, they were more like technical levels for maintenance and the location of workshops and rest areas for personnel, but as is usually the case, the place was chosen by the lower classes. People who did not have enough money for anything better, who did not even have the money to fly to one of the colonies. It was there, Amos pointed with his still trembling hand to the far corner of the room, barely visible due to the clouds of steam periodically escaping from the technical communications. And what did it look like? Michael raised an eyebrow skeptically. Like death. Garibaldi was about to tell Amos everything he thought about his sick imagination and other mental problems, but at that very moment, somewhere around the corner, a sharp rustle was heard, causing the men to become wary and Amos to flinch. Michael, with a purely reflexive movement, pulled out his service weapon, cautiously moving forward.
According to the laws of the genre, the rustling was made by one of the local inhabitants, a tramp, of which there were dozens, if not hundreds, at the station. The man was digging through a mountain of technical garbage, hoping to profit from something that could be sold or exchanged for food and drink. Having barely heard the menacing "stop" from the head of the security service, the homeless man ran away as if he had decided to develop superluminal speed. Garibaldi cursed and turned sharply towards his companion, grabbing him by the overalls and pulling him towards himself. The security guard's gaze did not bode well. Even a blind man would have realized that Michael was very, very unhappy with what was happening, which meant that someone was about to get beaten, probably hard, possibly kicked, or even hit on the head. I swear, I saw that creature. I'm telling the truth.
The man broke free from Garibaldi's grip, ran out into the middle of the room and threw his scarf and vest on the floor in a rage.
Are you looking for me? So here I am. Come and get me, you bastard. Let's sort this out once and for all, forever.
Exhausted by the outburst of anger, Amos almost fell onto a nearby shipping container. The man's shoulders shook with silent sobs. It seemed that the situation had exhausted the tramp much more than Michael could have imagined, and he was already beginning to doubt that he could and should be called a madman. The head of the station's security service had seen a lot in his life, and he knew very well what hopeless despair was. During the war, Garibaldi began with a sigh, slowly approaching his companion who was still sitting. I had one guy who claimed that our defense was weak. The entire garrison laughed at him. We knew that the defense was as reliable as it could be. But he continued to insist. We thought he was crazy. Until the first battle, Michael carefully picked up Amy's things, handing them to the men and sitting down next to him, right on the floor. And one night, none of us were laughing anymore. The enemy went through our defenses like a knife through butter. That guy was the first to die, but he managed to raise the alarm, managed to warn the others. Of course, he was crazy, but he turned out to be right. Garibaldi smiled sadly. That's why I believe you, Amos. It was a dignified death. The tramp pressed the scarf to his chest, looking at the man with eyes full of understanding. Tell me, where did you serve? Garibaldi knew that Amos had once been a soldier, like himself. He had been through the Earth-Minbari War. He had been a veteran, and as for many veterans, those events had not been in vain, leaving a harsh mark on the psyche and on the whole life. Some things are never forgotten, and they do not go away, no matter what psychologists and psychiatrists of all stripes say. But sometimes, it became easier, especially if you had someone to tell. Someone who had gone through something similar and could hear, listen, and most importantly, understand. We were considered a reconnaissance unit, the man shrugged. We were dropped on an asteroid so that we could observe and make sorties behind enemy lines. The Minbari were planning to occupy the sector. Our camp was set up in some ancient ruins. Amis shook his head. I don't even know whose they were, but the asteroid was considered uninhabited. It came at night. The veteran who spoke had melancholy in his eyes. During a storm. We didn't see or hear anything, just as all the sensors and detectors were silent. And it went straight through the walls like a hot stream of air, like the wind. The first person who got in the way died a few steps away from me. I ran. Amis looked pitifully at Garibaldi. We all ran. I thought that I had managed to break away, that I had escaped. And then I saw him. His? Just a silhouette, like a shadow on a shadow. But lightning flashed around him. Amos sighed heavily. It was the devil himself. But how did you survive? And I didn't survive, Amos whispered in despair, jumping to his feet. They left me as a reserve. The creature became a part of my body. It fed on me, prolonging the pleasure. Those who died first were lucky. When the rescuers arrived on the asteroid, I weighed 38 kilograms. 38. And that's why I realized it was on the station. A part of me, the one it managed to eat, it's still somewhere inside, I can feel it. But no one believed me. Since you feel it, as always, when things started to get hot, Garibaldi's brain started working very quickly and efficiently. You can find it. Yes, I think I can. Amos nodded in surprise, listening to his feelings. It's waiting for this, calling.
A completely insane thirst for action flashed in the man's eyes, and Amos turned sharply, tearing himself away and running into the corridor. Garibaldi didn't have time for a split second, as the tramp had already disappeared around the corner and was lost among the intertwining corridors and clouds of steam. The devil. The man cursed. Amos, damn you. Spitting, Michael almost ran to the elevator. The information received from the man, firstly, required rechecking, although he felt in his gut that Amos was not lying. And secondly, he was obliged to inform the captain about new information. Any bit of information was useful to find and catch the unknown creature before it killed someone else on the Babylon. There had been silence in Captain Sheridan's office for several seconds. Garibaldi had recounted Amos's story, omitting what he considered to be insignificant details, bringing new information to Commander Ivanova and the station commander. And now the officers were digesting what they had heard. It looked so unrealistic in their eyes. The asteroid that Trump had mentioned really existed, and there had actually been an outpost on it during the war with Minbar. Sheridan, like Garibaldi, had checked this point first. But everything else? Ivanova, who was sitting next to Garibaldi, kept frowning. Something in everything that was happening was bothering her. Some thought was buzzing somewhere on the edge of her consciousness, constantly falling out of focus but not disappearing completely, and this was starting to irritate the commander. She had already experienced similar irritability and loss of focus before, but she was absolutely sure that she would never miss Alfred Bester's arrival at the station. But something in everything that was happening was clearly wrong. According to official data, the post on the asteroid was destroyed by a Minbari cruiser.
The captain walked around the office thinking about the situation. Amos doesn't know much, I don't argue, but he knows one thing for sure. The Minbari didn't attack the post, at least not at that moment. They were attacked by the devil himself, as he says. Garibaldi spread his hands, settling more comfortably in his chair. Veterans of any war always tend to remember events somewhat differently from people who did not take direct part in them, and it's hard to call them Minbari sweethearts. But the devil? Is there more scientific information? No, sir. Okay, Amos mentioned that the creature took part of his insides, right? The captain's head still couldn't wrap his head around all this mystical murk, but he was a rather pragmatic officer, which meant that if something could help get the job done, it didn't matter how much nonsense he perceived it as. Yes, Garibaldi nodded. And he can feel when it's near. How? Symbiosis, sir?
It seems so. Garibaldi and Sheridan nodded in unison. Moreover, Michael continued, if something similar happened to Dr. Franklin's patient, she should also be able to help find this creature. No, Ivanova sighed, shaking her head, getting up from her chair and trying to concentrate on the conversation. This is too risky a plan. We don't even know the nature of this creature. How are we going to catch it? Besides, if this is really a symbiosis, the degree of its influence on people could be enormous, and suddenly neither Maria nor Amos will be able to control their actions. So far, I've only understood one thing. John summed up the meeting. We won't look for the devil. He will come to us himself, and we will prepare. Oh, so this is where you are. Lord Baal's incredibly pleased voice, as usual, was heard from the entrance, and then he himself appeared in the room. Lord Baal? Sheridan frowned in surprise. What do we owe you? Meow.
The sound that rang out made everyone except the Goa'uld flinch and look around.
What the hell?
Garibaldi almost jumped out of his chair, realizing that he was not alone in it. Only now did Ivanova's consciousness clear up, and she realized with incredible surprise that all this time a large and incredibly fluffy black cat had been lying on Mr. Garibaldi's lap, lounging languidly. Moreover, Michael, without giving himself the slightest account of what was happening, was automatically scratching this creature behind the ear, forcing it to squint its eyes in satisfaction. And it was this cat that had just meowed in response to Lord Baal's cry. "It's all right, Mr. Garibaldi." Baal, still smiling broadly, approached the shocked Michael. "This cat is my friend, and subordinate in a way." The Goa'uld ambassador leaned down, lightly stroking the cat between the ears, which began to purr in a bass voice. "Lord Baal." Ivanova jumped up, finally putting together all the details that had been bothering her. "This, he can use telepathy?" "Well, yes," Baal shrugged. "It's a G-Rings, a special psi-cat. They are all capable of telepathy. But don't worry." The man waved his hand. "First of all, he is still a cat." "And what does this mean, Lord Baal?" Sheridan asked sternly, looking from the tense Ivanova to the still shocked Garibaldi and back. "This means, Captain Sheridan, that he considers himself a superior being, and he doesn't give a damn about any and all secrets of the pathetic two-legged servants." The ambassador emphasized the words with his fingers in quotation marks, "whose only purpose and meaning in life is to worship, scratch behind the ear, feed and clean the litter box." "But it seems," Ivanova exhaled tiredly, massaging the bridge of her nose with her fingers. "Now I am finally beginning to understand how, or rather why, the cult of cats developed in ancient Egypt." "You finally understood the whole point, Madame Commander." Leaning towards Garibaldi, who was still sitting, Baal carefully picked up the cat. "I apologize for the unceremonious intrusion." The Goa'uld ambassador put on a guilty smile. "With your permission, I will no longer interfere with your meeting." Having made a polite bow, the man slowly left the captain's office, taking the rather squinting cat with him. Ivanova could not be 100% sure, but for some reason, she persistently thought that the foray impudent fellow, the cat, not Lord Baal, winked at her with a green eye, with an extremely satisfied expression on his impudent muzzle. "Am I the only one who didn't understand what just happened?" Sheridan finally broke the silence that had reigned. "It was Baal," Garibaldi answered phlegmatically. "I realized it was Lord Baal." The captain clicked his teeth in irritation. "But what the hell? It was Baal, Captain." Ivanova sighed heavily.
Take my word for it. It's easier for you to just accept this mantra and repeat it to yourself as often as possible. You did it on purpose. I don't understand what you're talking about. Still maintaining a satisfied expression on his face, Behemoth replied. "You could have easily overheard their meeting sitting outside. I continue to slowly carry the cat in my arms, moving away from the captain's office where I caught him. But then Mr. Garibaldi wouldn't be able to scratch me. I could only shake my head at such an argument, but I had nothing to counter it with. In any case, the telepath was doing his duties perfectly, which meant I had no reason to be indignant. Yes, with a probability of 90.653%. Each of the three present there would come to me with a multitude of questions, but let them. Did you learn anything interesting? Meow. Behemoth's demonstrative meow made a passing technician recoil in surprise and follow us with a surprised look. Nevertheless, the cat transmitted a short excerpt from the briefing in one package, adding personal considerations of the participants, which they preferred not to voice. By and large, there was not much critical information there, except for the fact that the Energit was able to absorb organic matter in parts, preserving the life and relative health of its victim until the very end, and at the same time somehow connecting itself and its food in an unclear way. Analysis of the information received from Garibaldi from Amis, and indirectly confirmed by the behavior of Maria Cyrus, gave a probability of 78.65% that this was required to a greater extent for subsequent tracking of the prey, in case it managed to escape, and the feedback was simply an undesirable side effect. However, it was undesirable only for the original being, but it opened up additional possibilities for me. I could not yet put them into hardware, so to speak, and the theoretical calculations required additional experiments and tests, but such a connection persistently resembled the ability of the Vorlons to divide their self and to implant practically independent particles of consciousness in other living beings in order to see with their eyes, and from the ability to see to the ability to control. The distance, honestly, is not that great. It seems that I am beginning to think like a real evil genius, or the Lord of Darkness.
In any case, first it was necessary to catch the energy one, and preparations for this significant event had already been made. The station's replicator sensors had registered another appearance of our hungry guest, this time in Sector 19.
Considering that the Babylon computer network had almost immediately issued a command to lock down the level, and that several security detachments had suddenly headed in the same direction, Captain Sheridan was also obviously aware of it. As was Garibaldi, who was currently there, slowly retreating down the corridor and firing a blaster at the energy clot pursuing him and Maria. Garibaldi, the man who was beaten after all. Amos tried with all his might to convey to him that the creature was clearly immaterial. And he still went there. To shoot. No, from a dozen army blaster rifles it would be okay, but not from one pop gun. But we must give him credit. First of all, he was clearly not thinking about heroic deeds. Garibaldi managed to pull out 2 technicians along the way, leaving them in a safe place. And here comes our guest.
Energet managed to hook Amos and was now holding him in the air at a height of 1.5 meters, judging by the sensor readings, slowly and thoroughly licking his lunch that had been put off for later. The tramp was conscious, although judging by his face and behavior he was weakly perceiving what was happening, being rather on the edge. Garibaldi only managed to point at the body of the creature barely visible behind Amos, when a thin beam of light struck right through the ceiling, covering the area of space around the energy man and his prey. Capturing an immaterial entity using Asgard's teleport was not an impossible task, but it required fulfilling a large number of conditions. Therefore, I took a simpler path. A complex structure similar to the drone system I had used to capture the Shadow Scout, but on a much smaller scale, had been transferred to the station from the Hattak, still hanging in orbit around Epsilon 3, a spherical system of force field emitters that covered space in all known field and wave ranges to the replicators. The field was supposed to prevent the energy worker from moving in space, changing phase states as the shadows did, and generally doing anything other than staying in the allocated volume. With a quiet groan, Amos fell down, released by the creature that sensed trouble. The figure, woven from glowing lightning, became visible for a few seconds even in the normal spectrum. Energet jerked once, twice, tried, like the Shadow Scout, to push through the seemingly thin film of the field with a blow from the appendage that clearly replaced his hand. No way. Having made sure that the cage held securely, I gave the command to teleport the area limited by the emitters. A wide beam of light struck from the ceiling with a grinding sound, and with a loud pop, the sphere disappeared, shaking Garibaldi and Sheridan and Ivanova, who had just made it to the finale of the performance, with a wave of air filling the resulting vacuum. A hyperspace jump window opened like a blue cloud in front of the Hattak, and the ship immediately took off towards my laboratory. A place for permanent, albeit short-lived, residence had already been prepared for the new research object. Amos lay unconscious on the floor of the station level. Interlude. What the hell was that? Can someone explain? Sheridan, who had only made it to the very end, barely managed to stay on his feet from the wave of air that suddenly pulled him forward with force.
A flash of bright light that caught his eyes and a quiet but distinct grinding sound were a part of the package. But most of all, the captain was captivated by the important moment that just now, right before his eyes, the unknown creature that had set the whole station on its ears and that they were hunting literally evaporated. Amiss. Garibaldi almost ran the meter separating him from the tramp lying on the ground. Ah, he's alive, bastard. Having made sure that his new acquaintance, at least at first glance, was simply unconscious, Michael breathed a sigh of relief, spitting on the floor. Am I the only one worried that the creature we were hunting just disappeared into a beam of light? He's gone, Amiss groaned weakly, struggling to sit up. Who is no longer there? Creatures. I don't feel it. I used to feel it. The tramp nodded gratefully to Garibaldi, who was supporting him by the shoulder. Towards the end, I felt it very well, but now it's gone. It's gone. Escaped? Sheridan frowned. I'm not sure. At the very end, Amiss looked around the corridor with a cloudy gaze. Even though I was unconscious, I clearly felt his fear. I don't know what happened, but this what was clearly not to this creature's liking. Sheridan cursed again, contacting the support team via his wrist communicator,
and reporting that the problem seemed to have been solved. True, he categorically did not like this seems. John preferred to understand what was happening and why it was happening. And now, in the past couple of hours of events that he did not understand, in his opinion, a little more than normal had happened. And something told the man that he should ask questions, a lot of questions. Mr. Garibaldi, the captain continued to remain wary. I will be only too happy if your new acquaintance turns out to be right, but it would be better to double-check.
I will wait for Dr. Franklin. I think he has finished with the victims, and you check the levels above and below ours, in case the creature has escaped.
I'll do it, Garibaldi nodded, quickly walking towards the guards who had arrived, gesturing to take 2 of them with him.
Captain, came a voice from the communicator.
Sheridan speaking.
Incoming hypertunnel. This is Calvados.
I'll be there right now. Commander, can you handle this? He turned to Ivanova.
Yes, go ahead, Captain.
Sheridan nodded and headed towards the elevator.
What have you done to my ship, first mate?
The captain who had entered the station's bridge had difficulty holding back from using stronger expressions, looking through the observation window at the frigate that had flown up to the Babylon. The entire hull of the Calvados was covered in numerous dents, clearly the result of pulse weapon impacts. Several external armor plates were missing, torn from their places, revealing the main structure of the ship. But despite all this, the frigate was clearly on the move and had not lost its combat capability. On the face of Lieutenant Prendick displayed on the terminal display, there was a collected but completely calm and confident expression in his abilities. Those who had suffered defeat in battle, in the captain's experience, did not look like this. I apologize, Captain. Prendick smiled wryly. We were a little scratched. If you don't mind, I'll hand over the Calvados to the technicians first, and then come back to you with a report. We saw something along the way. To hell with the report. The dumbfounded Sheridan continued to examine the ship. Are there any losses? Not at all. Prendick shook his head. No harm done to the crew. Mission accomplished. I don't think there are any major pirate gangs left in the vicinity of Babylon 5, considering how many of them piled up on us at the end. Okay, I'll wait for you in the office in an hour. We'll discuss it in more detail. Yes, sir. Calvados has terminated the connection. Edward nodded, disconnecting, and the ship, under his control, smoothly moved towards the main dock of the station, entering the hangars for technical maintenance. The captain could only frown, examining the damage received by the prototype from a closer angle. No, the fact that Prendick had completed the task of chasing and mauling pirates definitely pleased Sheridan. It was beneficial not only to trade and cargo transportation, but also added extra points to the account card of the new ship. But damn it, deep down the captain was jealous that he himself did not participate in what was happening, and a little offended that his new ship, only recently launched, had already received damage. However, judging by the results of visual observations and data from scanners, this damage was indeed more of a cosmetic nature. The ship's hull was intact, the power plant was operating normally, and its combat capabilities were clearly not yet exhausted. If there was a war now, no admiral would even think of withdrawing the Calvados from the combat zone, at most rotating it with a less damaged combat unit. It seems that the engineers who built the frigate knew their business well. A miracle is any phenomenon with a probability of less than 20%. Enrico Fermi. Low probability does not mean zero. Toa Tokuchi, one to eliminate. The creature that fell into my greedy paws was truly curious.
And it was worth starting with the paradoxical fact that was not an energy life form in the direct and full sense of the term.
Incredible but true. This creature had a physical body shell of the inside, DNA, metabolism, and all the other attributes of any normal organism. However, it was able to almost completely change its aggregate state, becoming somewhat immaterial. In this state, the creature represented the very same superposition of electromagnetic fields that the replicator sensors had detected on Babylon, and was able to ignore the overwhelming majority of influences based on ordinary physics, could pass through walls, and most importantly, enter into some kind of symbiotic parasitic relationship with any other organic living creature. In fact, the Soldier of Darkness, as its relatives were called by the younger races that encountered them in the past, merged with the body of its victim, embedding the energetic part of itself into the nervous system of its prey, in order to thoroughly and leisurely absorb nutrients until only a skeleton and dried tissue remained from the lunch. Somehow, this version of existence was similar to how I imagined the Vorlon's form, shown in the frames of the series. Yes, in reality everything could turn out completely differently, and it was useless to draw any bold conclusions without having one of Ambassador Kosh's relatives on the neighboring autopsy table.
In any case, even with all the assumptions, I seriously doubted that the Vorlons were as, animals as my new guest.
At the first moment, when the teleportation beam had just captured and transferred the allocated volume of space together with the creature, it tried to seep through the surrounding force field in the same way as it had passed through the walls at the station. And it continued its attempts throughout the entire, albeit short time, of the Hut Tuck's flight to my planet, without drawing any conclusions at all from the failure of its actions. It was somewhat reminiscent of an ordinary fly stubbornly pecking at a window pane that was indestructible to it. In any case, after a certain amount of experimentation, the replicators selected a certain combination of high-frequency electrical impulses that were able to affect the creature even in its energetic phase of existence. It seems that this is the reason why the blasters of the Earthlings were able to cause him some damage, but part of the spectrum of radiation of the plasma cloth that they fired acted in a similar way, partially knocking him out of his immaterial state and repeatedly causing damage to the physical shell. And then it was just a matter of technique. Physiologically, the Soldier of Darkness was an upright predatory lizard somewhat similar to the civilization of humanoid lizards I had already discovered, living on the green planet in the primitive communal system. If by somewhat similar we mean 69.389% of matching DNA, of course. This was much less than that of humans and monkeys, but nevertheless, they were related species, although incapable of interbreeding without additional genetic influences from the outside. As sad as it was to admit, my prey did not bring the expected profit.
Although, of course, during the study, the replicators compiled a complete genetic map of the test subject and practically literally took it apart screw by screw. For me, the replicator, this was of no fundamental interest, but it opened up additional opportunities in a still new area of activity for replicators, namely genetic experiments and the creation of new living forms with given parameters. The ability to become invisible and practically intangible for a living creature was a good addition to other functions. I was distracted from further analysis of the results of the lizard's research by the signal of an incoming call that came from the terminal on the table, and then by the extremely thoughtful and tense face of Captain Sheridan on his display. Lord Baal, forgive me for disturbing you. It seemed that his reserve of ability to ignore the strangeness around him had finally run out, but could you spare me some time for a conversation?
Captain Sheridan, I smile. I am always glad to have a pleasant conversationalist. Then if you really don't mind, I'll be with you in about 15 minutes. Any time, Captain. Sheridan nodded and hung up. It was curious, but let's be honest. I had been expecting his visit, or at least a call, a little earlier. Teleporting Franklin and Garibaldi, healing the latter and bringing him out of his coma, and now stealing the main culprit of the latest commotion at the station from under the very noses of the senior officers of the station, Sheridan was an incredibly patient man. Well, or he simply did not have the free time to sort out this as well. Most likely the latter. As far as I could imagine the depths of the local bureaucracy's hell, the first few weeks after taking office, the commander of Babylon 5 might not have had enough time even for a good night's sleep and 3 meals a day, let alone talking to ambassadors.
And then Calvados returned to the station, and returned clearly damaged. I'll have to take a peek at the ship's crew's reports on their last flight to understand how the prototype ship performed in action. I need to understand how effectively the Papuans used the glass beads given to them, don't I?
Come in, Captain Sheridan. As promised, the commander of the Babylon stood at the door to my cabin 15 minutes and 10 seconds later. Incredible punctuality for a human being. Thank you, Lord Baal, the clearly tense man sighed, walking through the door that opened in front of him. Before we get down to the business part of the meeting, would you like some tea? I motioned for John to sit down in one of the chairs in the corner while heading towards the kitchen corner. Maybe just a little. The captain shrugged thoughtfully, sitting down and carefully looking around the cabin's interior.
Sheridan was a really straightforward person, which may have hindered him in his career, but at the same time it gave him a certain amount of trust and positive attitude from the crews he had led in his life. Well, and it allowed him to read what was going on in his soul without much effort. And now John was clearly surprised by the abundance of gold panels, made in a near-Egyptian style, high-quality furniture, and the general luxury of the setting, which in his eyes did not fit well with a cabin on a space station, even with a cabin in the embassy sector. However, with all his surprise, he did not forget to absorb the information. And I was more than sure that after our meeting, the captain would more than once scroll through everything he had seen in his memory, trying to form a personal impression of after the gold, and understand what and how to do with me.
Please, Captain Sheridan. I put a tray with a teapot, cups, and a plate of cookies on the table, chuckling to myself that it seems that it is already becoming a tradition for me to conduct important negotiations at this very table with a cup of tea and pastries.
Thank you, Lord Baal. Sheridan nodded.
So, I sit down in front of the man, pouring the aromatic drink into cups. To what do I owe your visit? I can guess, though. I shrug with a smile. But it would be easier to listen to you, to avoid misunderstandings. What's going on here? I raise an eyebrow at the strange wording of the first question. We are going to have some tea, Captain. No, The man sighed, closing his eyes for a second. Forgive me, Lord Baal. I'm a little confused. I wanted to ask, or rather, discuss something else. Recent events. I assume I continue for the captain that you mean the incident with the jeerings? Including... I'm not even talking about the fact that pets are not supposed to be on 005. No. Sheridan raised his palms in front of him, not letting me say anything. I have nothing against it, especially since in the case of the embassy sector a compromise can always be found. But is he really a telepath? If I use your terms, I nod, smiling. Behemoth really is a telepath. The... Behemoth? Cough, the captain, who had just taken a sip of tea at that very moment, began to cough. But Behemoth the cat? Not exactly a cat, Captain, I shake my head. Earrings are quite different from Earth cats physiologically, but outwardly they are, perhaps, similar. I fully understand your concern, but I assure you, as I said, first of all, Behemoth is a typical, I would even say, textbook cat. Behemoth the cat, the man breathed out barely audibly. At my station, Behemoth the cat. Ahem, Lord Baal, I don't know much about telepaths and their peculiarities, but something tells me that a telepathic animal is beyond the realm of possibility. By the way, where is he now? Sheridan looked around the cabin with some tension. Walking, I nod. And about animals with telepathic gifts. Captain, I sigh. You have no idea how rich the universe's imagination is. Even in your galaxy alone you can find a great many incredible things and phenomena, not to mention others. So why do you think that highly developed intelligence is a privilege only for a humanoid species? Yes, to tell the truth, I haven't looked at this issue from this point of view until now. The man fell silent thoughtfully, burying his face in his cup, periodically taking a sip or two of tea. It was obvious that Sheridan was trying to wrap his head around the idea that somewhere there could exist not just an animal with a fully fledged mind comparable to a human, but one that could also possess telepathy, like telepaths of any familiar race. At the thought of what kind of faces someone from the Psi Corpus would have if they found out about Behemoth, Sheridan couldn't help but grin maliciously. I see you're impressed. I smile back with a wide smile. I just imagine the reaction of the Earth's Psi Corps to such news. Yes, I suppose they would be very glad. We exchanged knowing glances. It was becoming quite obvious that the Psi Corps was disliked not only by ordinary civilian telepaths, which was natural, but also by many representatives of other departments. In any case, as the commander of Babylon 5, the captain sighed. I can't help but feel uneasy about this. Even a regular telepath with direct connections to one of the ambassadors always raises suspicions among other diplomats, and a cat telepath. I repeat, Captain. I spread my hands. Behemoth is to a greater extent and first of all a cat, and only then a telepath.
This means that it is much more interesting for him to read the thoughts of those around him, where he can get a free saucer of milk and a piece of fresh fish, than to eavesdrop on terrible diplomatic secrets.
Oh, the captain sighed heavily, taking a large sip of tea. I hope the other diplomats will be able to understand such an argument, if such a question is nevertheless raised. If they are bothered by something, you can always send them directly to me, I smiled broadly, saluting the captain with my cup. But something tells me that this is not the only thing that worries you, Captain. That's right, Sheridan straightened up. If you don't mind, I'd like to discuss two cases. The healing of Mr. Garibaldi and the disappearance of an unknown life form that recently made its way onto the station. And what interests you? What was that?
I mean that bright white light in which you, Franklin, and Garibaldi first disappeared and then reappeared, and in which that creature disappeared in exactly the same way. I checked the databases. I looked through all the files available to me, both on the station and on the network. And I raise an eyebrow curiously. Nothing. Well, really, I'm not going to take the ancient legends of the Earth and the religious traditions of various peoples completely seriously. You will definitely be surprised, Captain, how close to the truth many legends and myths of different peoples actually are. Of course, if you interpret them correctly and understand what exactly you are looking for. Excuse me? The surprise in the man's voice could be felt almost physically. I have already discussed a similar topic with your predecessor, Commander Sinclair. I pour myself a fresh portion of tea.
Legends and myths differ from fairy tales in that they have a basis, some real phenomenon that occurred, which, at that moment, simply could not be explained without the involvement of supernatural forces. But excuse me, can divine miracles, described for example in the Bible, be somehow explained from a scientific point of view? Give me an example, I say, making a wide, inviting gesture with my hand. Well, turning water into wine? Practical application of nuclear physics? Just like in the case of the alchemist's dream, only with a little more ingenuity. I shrug my shoulders, figuring to myself that such a process is theoretically possible, although it would require a simply monstrously disproportionate expenditure of energy. The man frowned. The resurrection of Lazarus? Captain, I look at the man reproachfully, shaking my head. You saw Mr. Garibaldi.
Or should I have raised my hands to the ceiling and majestically exclaimed something like, "Garibaldi, get out!" I'm afraid I might have been misunderstood. Sheridan's face reflected a serious mental work, but the essence of the message was clearly clear to the captain. And now he tried to comprehend whether it was possible that any truly miraculous miracle could have a logical explanation that did not contradict known physical laws and processes. It certainly requires far more knowledge and free time than I will ever have, Sheridan sighed. But still, your example, although striking to the perception, does not fully explain what exactly I saw then in the corridor and the medical bay of the station. Teleportation, I smile. But is that possible? Teleportation, it's instantaneous movement of matter from one point in space to another. That is, I look at him with some malice, the possibility of traveling faster than the speed of light, using transition zones and hyperspace, which is essentially a parallel dimension, does not bother you, but teleportation is already too much? Oh, I'm starting to think that it would have been better if I hadn't asked. Sheridan finished his tea in one gulp, putting the cup on the table. Believe me, Captain Sheridan, the universe around you is a much more interesting place than you can even imagine. And sometimes, I smile, it is much more interesting and unexpected than even I can imagine. That's what scares me, Lord Baal. I'd like something simpler. Bureaucracy, a couple of diplomatic scandals, an interplanetary war in the neighboring sector, and not the sinister soldiers of darkness, as Ambassador Jakar pathetically calls them. Okay, the captain sighed. I think I understood what you wanted to tell me. Well, or I think I did. In any case, to avoid misunderstandings, do I understand correctly that neither your cat nor that creature will cause problems that threaten the safety of Babylon and its inhabitants? I can assure you of that. I nod. Behemoth is an extremely well-managed Gearings, and that creature, it's unlikely that you'll ever see it again. Well, perhaps that's enough. John rose from his chair, straightening his uniform jacket. If I think about what's happening for even a minute longer, I'm afraid my head will explode. Thank you for the conversation and the tea, Lord Baal. Sheridan bowed slightly awkwardly. Always at your service, Captain. I also stand up, smiling and bowing in return. The captain nodded, walked slightly unsteadily, his face deep in thought, and left my cabin. I hope I didn't break our captain too much with such a simple conversation. After all, he is the main character of the upcoming theatrical performance in this galaxy. It would be a shame to screw everything up in such an innocent way. Well. Interlude. After leaving the Goa'uld ambassador, Sheridan walked mindlessly down the corridor for a while, replaying the conversation in his head.
He was gradually beginning to understand what Ivanova had meant when she advised him to simply say one single argument for all oddities. The mantra, "It was Baal." The Goa'uld ambassador's answers were absolutely clear in their form, strictly to the questions he asked, but at the same time they were completely, incredibly uninformative in their essence. Yes, Baal has a telepathic cat named Behemoth, but who is not a cat but a Syrinx, whatever that means. Yes, he can read minds no worse than any telepath in the Psychor, but no, he is not interested in that. He's more concerned with purely feline matters.
Yes, Baal has technologies that allow him to almost revive the dead and instantly transport them across space. But no, that is not magic, and if it is magic, then how is it worse than any miracle from the scriptures performed by the Christian God? That in the case of divine miracles, you personally cannot explain them? Well, that is only your problem, isn't it? Sheridan exhaled loudly, shaking his head in an attempt to dispel the disturbing and confusing thoughts. He would have been better off chasing pirates on his good old Agamemnon. Even the prototype frigate Calvados would have been far preferable to this space madhouse, inexplicably called the diplomatic space station Babylon 5. Speaking of the Calvados...
Having glanced at the first reflective surface he came across, and making sure that his face did not express the full extent of his shock at what was happening, but was more befitting of the title of captain, Sheridan finally reached the elevator leading from the embassy level. Although he had arranged a meeting with Prendick in an hour, in reality, placing such a large warship in the station's docks required a little more time from both crews. No, the dimensions of the Calvados easily allowed it to enter the Babylon dock, intended for liners and medium-tonnage transporters that did not require unloading from the outside, but the frigate was still a warship, especially a prototype, which immediately imposed slightly different requirements for security, secrecy, and the implementation of repair protocols.
And Sheridan was still trying not to think about the potential likelihood of receiving a complaint from some state about the very fact of the presence of a military vessel on a diplomatic station.
In any case, now he had just the time to come and get to his office, quickly look over the electronic version of the report that his senior assistant had sent him over the network, and prepare for a more detailed discussion of the first real combat sortie of the ship entrusted to him.
May I allow you, Captain?
Come in, Lieutenant. Sheridan put aside the tablet on which he had been reading Lieutenant Prendick's report on the completion of the mission and in particular, the last battle for the last 10 minutes. Sit down. Thank you. Edward sat down in the chair opposite the captain's desk. First of all, John tapped his finger on the tablet. I have to say I'm impressed. Aside from the fact that I had no idea how many pirates were actually hanging around the station, I couldn't even hope when I sent you and the Calvados that you'd seem to be able to clear them all out at once. I can't be sure that we knocked them all out, Prendick shook his head, but we definitely thinned them out. I understand. After all, neither you nor anyone else has ever seen their base. And such active units, even pirate ones, simply must have at least a station, if not some kind of controlled planetoid. It's unlikely to be a planetoid, sir. Then it would be very easy to pin them down. And the station, especially a small one, if you really want to, the lieutenant emphasized in his tone, can be moved. Agreed. In any case, you did a great job, Lieutenant. You and the crew deserve a rest and a bonus. Thank you, sir, Prendick smiled. The boys will be pleased. The entertainment part of the station is at your disposal.
The main thing is not to cause any special disturbances, otherwise the head of security will scold me for a week.
Sheridan smiled broadly, showing that he was joking but still meant exactly what he said. Don't worry, Captain. I'll make sure the crew behaves decently. I'll draw up a duty schedule on board. I never doubted you. So, Lieutenant. John regained his serious look. As far as I understood the unspoken words and hints in your report, you would like to communicate something in a personal capacity. Yes, sir. I'm listening. The first of your leads that we worked on, Edward began carefully, choosing his words carefully, were nothing special. Small groups of pirates attacking particularly tasty-looking cargo ships, a few richer passenger ships. In short, nothing unusual. The captain nodded. But I would like to especially note the last encounter in which, by the way, we received most of the damage. I see.
That is, all those hits that I saw on the hull of the Calvados were received in one battle?
Yes, sir. The first mate nodded. In your report, you mentioned a pirate aircraft carrier. Yes, sir. In addition to the small ships waiting for their prey at the transition zone, their flagship emerged on us. But I didn't want to tell you exactly about that. The man leaned towards the captain, lowering his voice. I would like to be mistaken, but that attack was clearly planned, and the target was precisely the Calvados. What? John raised his eyebrows in surprise. Reasons. Before the attack, we recorded a transmission from normal space, short, encrypted. We were unable to intercept it. It lasted too little. But it was this, I think, that forced their flagship to enter into active combat. I have never seen pirates, even in the case of numerical superiority, risk attacking an obviously combat ship, especially one of an unknown design. Sounds...
Sheridan stroked his chin thoughtfully. Not exactly provable, but quite logical. And disturbing. Yes, sir. That's why I didn't risk including this detail and my suspicions in the report. In case someone from the Babylon was involved in this, Captain Sheridan sighed, understanding the logic of his first officer's arguments. Thank you, Lieutenant. Prendick simply bowed his head in response, and silence reigned in the office for a while. The news brought by the lieutenant was indeed alarming. John was not an idealist and understood perfectly well that in this world any reasonable person could be bought or intimidated. The main thing was to choose the right price. But still, something in the story bothered him more than usual.
Only a few people knew about the mission on which the Calvados was leaving. He, himself, Ivanova, possibly Garibaldi. Sheridan suspected that without Michael's knowledge, the only thing one could do on the station was go to the toilet, and even that was not a fact. And one of the dispatchers, through whom the ship's flight sheet passed, recording the frigate's departure.
I understand. The captain turned his attention to Prendick, who clearly wanted to tell him something. You have any other news? Yes, Captain. We dealt with the pirate flagship quickly, the lieutenant shrugged. They definitely didn't expect that a frigate, even of an unknown design, could have such performance characteristics as the Calvados. The enemy ship managed to fire exactly 2 salvos and launch fighters before it was destroyed. Sheridan brought up a recording of the prototype's approach to the station on his terminal screen, carefully examining the visually visible damage and traces of battle on the hull. They didn't do it, Prendick said, bending slightly to see the image and shaking his head. And that's the main reason I wanted to report it to you personally, Captain. Edward sighed, reaching into his jacket's inner pocket and pulling out a data crystal. The first mate's fingers trembled slightly as he handed the data carrier to the captain. It was obvious that what had happened had left an indelible impression on the officer, leaving a mark even now on the station. Sheridan took the crystal, carefully inserting it into the socket on the terminal. A second later, the display blinked, starting to show a picture, obviously recorded from one of the frigate's course cameras. For the first 10 seconds, nothing special happened. A space battle familiar to the captain, taking place in degenerate space. The recording clearly captured the last second of the life of the pirate ship, as Edward said, destroyed by a well-calibrated long salvo from the main caliber of the Calvados. But at that very moment, when the frigate was already turning away from the enemy ship, literally falling apart before our eyes, torn apart by multiple explosions of damaged power plants, trying to finish off the smaller ships that continued to harass, at the very edge of the camera's resolution, among the crimson shimmers of hyperspace, a huge and ominous shadow appeared. What the hell? You expressed yourself surprisingly politely, Captain. It was quite problematic to clearly see the unknown object. Its body itself, being completely black, seemed to absorb the light, sometimes as if merging with the surrounding space, but its actions were hard to miss. The next moment, a thin but blindingly bright purple beam of energy struck from the unknown. Ship? In the direction of the Calvados.
The image from the camera jerked sharply, floating somewhere to the side, and then the frame shook noticeably. At that moment, I was in control of the ship myself, Prendick explained. I don't know what it was, where it came from, but his attack, nothing less than a miracle, only caught us at the very edge. But that was enough. She completely blew off one of the outer armor plates, as if she didn't even notice. It was at that moment that the picture shook, and yes, Captain, it wasn't recorded on the camera or sensors, but just before the salvo, we all heard some kind of screech, really chilling to the bone. A screech? The captain frowned. Did something else happen to the ship? I don't know, Prendick shook his head. No sound vibrations were detected, on any frequency, but this sound was heard by the entire crew, from the officers on the bridge to the technicians in engineering. I checked.
some kind of mysticism. But who are they? Some kind of alien?
John rewound the recording, trying to get to more or less clear frame.
I have no idea. The lieutenant shook his head. There are no ships of this type in the bases. It is incredibly fast and powerful. With all due respect, sir. The man grimaced, but Prendick clearly knew how to acknowledge the achievements of others. If our battle had lasted a little longer, I would not be talking to you. With all the capabilities of the Calvados, with all my skills, the most I could do was prevent it from accurately targeting the ship. And even then, thinking about it here and now, I can't call it anything other than a miracle. Sheridan started the recording again, staring at the screen. As Edward had said, the unknown ship's attacks were literally meters away from the frigate, and they were so energetic that the interference they created caused ripples on the camera footage. One of the Shadow's shots hit the fragments of the pirate ship that continued to fly apart, piercing it as if there was nothing there at all. Our guns were practically ineffective. The picture in the frame jerked slightly and twin scarlet beams from the frigate's main caliber struck in the direction of the ominous ship. Sheridan expected to see the result of the hit, even being mentally prepared for its insignificance, but there was no effect. The enemy ship only jerked for a split second, clearly feeling the attack, but at the same moment it fired itself, and this time the image in the frame shook much more clearly. Realizing that further fighting could only lead to one result, our destruction, I decided to retreat. The senior assistant, clearly tense, squeezed the tabletop with his whitened fingers. He opened the transition zone and emerged into normal space not far from the colony. And the enemy? We were not pursued, and the man hesitated.
I can't prove it, but for some reason it seems to me that they simply let us escape.
Now, in a calm environment, thinking over the entire battle, I come to the only obvious conclusion. That ship was unable to identify the Calvados, just as we were unable to recognize it. And it clearly intended not to destroy it immediately, but to capture it for the purpose of studying it. That's why we were able to escape. But why didn't he follow you? Sheridan pulled the crystal out of its socket, thoughtfully twisting it in his fingers. It wasn't likely that a mining colony could pose a serious opponent for him. He wouldn't even notice their defense network. Prendick nodded. But it seems to me that whose ship this was, its owners clearly did not want to openly declare their presence. The Calvados alone, having left the battle, poses a risk of being discovered. And an entire colony with active transport traffic, logical.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Sheridan squeezed the crystal in his fist.
This is very important information, and very disturbing. Repairing the Calvados will take some time, so I will have time to carefully study the recording and decide what to do next. In the meantime, as I said, you and the crew deserve a well-deserved rest. Thank you, Captain. The lieutenant nodded seriously, rising to his feet. Drinking a glass of something stronger and falling asleep now sounds like a very tempting prospect. I can't blame you. John chuckled sympathetically. Thanks again for the important information. Rest, First Officer. I'll sign the official. Sheridan tapped his finger on the tablet lying on the table. Report and write you and the crew bonuses for successfully ridding the sector of a large number of pirates. Edward Prendick nodded dutifully and left the office with the quick steps of a tired but relieved man, leaving the captain alone with the information he had received.
Who could now lift this burden from his own shoulders, preferably without dropping it on his foot?